Welcome to Sleepy Legentale. Tonight, we are following an animal that has spent thousands of years quietly moving closer to us. If you enjoy these long journeys into the past, you can like the video and subscribe. And if you feel like it, tell me in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is there. And then you can settle in, because our story begins with a rather strange problem. The cat, sleeping on a blanket today, is descended from an animal that humans had remarkably little reason to domesticate. It could not pull a plough. It could not carry a rider. It gave no milk worth collecting, no wool to spin, and no useful amount of meat. It could not guard a herd in the way a dog might. It was not naturally inclined to obey commands, travel in a cooperative pack, or remain patiently wherever a human happened to put it. Its ancestors were small, largely solitary hunters. And yet, thousands of years later, their descendants would be allowed into one of the most private places human beings possess, our beds. Somewhere between those two worlds lies one of the strangest stories in domestication. And the first important thing to understand is that humans may not have started it. Long before there were Persian cats stretched across upholstered sofas, before Egyptian bronze cats wore earrings, before medieval monks complained about cats around their manuscripts, before Victorian judges began deciding which cat had the finest coat, there was simply a wild feline living beyond the edges of human settlement. The ancestry of the modern domestic cat leads principally toward the African and Near Eastern wildcat, Felis libica, particularly the lineage usually called Felis libica libica. If you encountered one of these wildcats without knowing what it was, the first surprise might be how familiar it looked. This was not some enormous prehistoric beast that gradually shrank into the animal beside your pillow. Its general body plan was already recognizably feline. A relatively small predator equipped with sharp hearing, sensitive whiskers, retractile claws, excellent low-light vision, and the ability to move quietly through an environment where its prey often survived by hearing danger before seeing it. It hunted small animals. Rodents were among them. And that fact would eventually matter more than almost anything else. For most of human existence, people had been mobile to varying degrees. Food was gathered, hunted, carried, consumed, shared, dried, cached, or stored according to place and season. But the development of agriculture in Southwest Asia changed the scale of the problem. People began investing enormous amounts of labor into food that remained in one place. A field of grain represented months of human effort. Seeds had to be obtained and planted. Crops had to survive weather and animals. The harvest had to be cut, gathered, transported, processed, and protected. Grain that could not be eaten immediately needed somewhere to wait. And so human beings began creating environments that had barely existed before. Permanent or semi-permanent settlements. Storage rooms, bins, baskets, granaries, piles and containers filled with concentrated calories. This was a tremendous achievement for humans. It was also excellent news for mice. A mouse did not understand agriculture, of course. It did not need to. From the rodent's perspective, humans had simply begun gathering food into convenient locations and then remaining nearby long enough to keep replenishing it. The very technology intended to protect people from hunger created a new kind of vulnerability. A mobile group might lose food to animals, but a farming household could lose part of an accumulated harvest. The damage was no longer simply the disappearance of tonight's meal. Stored grain represented future meals as well, and rodents had several advantages. They were small, they reproduced quickly, they could enter spaces humans could not easily reach, they could feed while people were asleep. They could gnaw through or around materials used for storage, contaminate food, and remain hidden inside the very structures people had built to protect their supplies. Agriculture had solved one problem by creating another. Fortunately for the farmers, somebody else had noticed the mice. Beyond the settlement lived small wildcats. They did not need to understand human beings either. They only needed to recognize opportunity. A farming village could produce something unusually attractive to a predator. A relatively dependable concentration of prey. The mice were following the grain. The cats could follow the mice. This is the foundation of what scholars commonly describe as the commensal pathway into domestication. Rather than beginning with humans capturing an animal because they wanted to redesign it for a particular job, the relationship may have developed through repeated proximity. Human settlement changed the environment. The altered environment favored rodents. The rodents attracted wildcats, and some wildcats were capable of tolerating humans well enough to exploit the opportunity. The important word here is some. A wildcat that fled at the first sign of human activity might remain outside the settlement. One willing to hunt a little closer to buildings could gain access to a richer feeding ground. Over generations, animals better able to tolerate human proximity would have had opportunities unavailable to their more fearful relatives. Humans, meanwhile, had their own reason for tolerance. The small predator near the grain store was eating the small animals that were eating the grain. Nobody needed to teach it how. That distinction separates the early cat from many of the animals humans deliberately put to work. A person does not have to explain a mouse to a cat. There is no training session required before the first hunt. The animal arrives with the relevant equipment already installed: hearing, patience, balance, claws, teeth, speed, and a predatory sequence refined long before the first human granary existed. In fact, changing the cat too much might have made it less useful. Humans needed it to remain very good at being a cat. So the earlier stage of this relationship may have been less like acquiring a servant and more like tolerating a useful neighbor. The arrangement did not require affection. It did not require ownership in the modern sense. It certainly did not require anyone to call the animal a pet. A wildcat could hunt near a settlement because prey was abundant, while humans could permit its presence because its hunting happened to protect resources. Both species benefited while pursuing entirely different goals. This is why the mouse deserves a surprisingly important place in the history of the domestic cat. Without stored grain, there is less concentrated rodent activity. Without concentrated rodents, there is less incentive for wildcats to remain close to human buildings. And without repeated proximity, the path toward the animal now sleeping on sofas becomes much less obvious. The first great step toward the house cat may therefore have been taken by neither a cat nor a human. It may have been taken by a mouse entering a grain store. There is a temptation to make this early world more intimate than the evidence allows. We should resist it. We do not know that the first farmers stroked these animals beside their fires. We cannot describe a particular wildcat curling against a particular child. We cannot identify the morning when someone decided that the animal outside was now part of the household. Domestication rarely gives archaeology such a convenient moment, and cats make the problem especially difficult because their skeletons remained remarkably similar to those of wildcats. With cattle or dogs, substantial physical change can sometimes help archaeologists distinguish domestic populations from their wild ancestors. Cats are more elusive. For thousands of years, humans had relatively little reason to transform their anatomy dramatically. A useful cat needed to stay agile. It needed its teeth. It needed its claws. It needed excellent senses. It needed to remain small enough to enter spaces where rodents hid. It needed, above all, to remain a predator. So the earliest cats can hide in the archaeological record almost as effectively as living cats hide in tall grass. A feline bone near an ancient settlement does not automatically tell us whether the animal belonged there, wandered there, was hunted there, was tolerated there, or lived alongside people. We need stronger evidence. And one of the strongest early clues does not come from the mainland farming villages, where we might expect the story to continue. It comes from an island. Cyprus sits in the eastern Mediterranean, separated from the mainland by open water. That geographical fact makes one archaeological discovery there exceptionally important. At the Neolithic site of Shilarokambos, archaeologists uncovered a human burial dating to roughly 9,500 years ago. Near the human lay the remains of a young feline, about 8 months old. The cat had been deliberately placed in close association with the burial. Other objects were present in the wider funerary context, including shells and polished items. The discovery is often described as evidence for one of the earliest known close relationships between humans and cats. That is reasonable. But we should be careful with the phrase often attached to it, the first pet cat. The burial cannot tell us exactly what the living relationship had been. We do not know whether the human had personally cared for the animal. We cannot know what the people performing the burial believed the feline represented. We cannot recover affection from bones alone. What we can say is already remarkable enough. A young feline had been deliberately placed near a human in a burial context approximately 9.5 millennia ago. And there is another fact that may be even more important. Cats of this type were not simply native inhabitants of Cyprus, waiting for archaeologists to discover them. Humans had transported felines to the island. At some point, people had taken a small predator aboard a prehistoric vessel and carried it across the sea. Think about what that means in practical terms. Not as a sentimental scene, because we do not know the circumstances, but as a logistical fact. A wild animal does not accidentally swim to Cyprus as part of a Neolithic migration. Someone had to bring felines into a human transport system. The exact reason is unknown. Rodent control is an obvious possibility, especially in communities carrying and storing food. But it cannot simply be assigned as the motive for every transported animal. Still, the act of transportation tells us something the presence of a cat beside a granary cannot. People were no longer merely tolerating felines that happened to live nearby. At least some were moving them. A cat had become worth taking somewhere. This is a profound transition. For a wildcat living near an agricultural settlement, humans are part of the environment. For a cat placed aboard a boat, humans become the means by which the environment itself can expand. The animal no longer has to wait for a suitable niche to appear naturally within walking distance. Humans can carry it to another shore. The same species that built the granary can now move the predator that patrols it. And once that begins, the future geography of the cat is tied to ours. Where humans sail, cats can sail. Where humans establish settlements, cats can establish populations. Where humans concentrate food, cats may find prey. This process would eventually carry domestic cats across an astonishing portion of the planet. But it did not happen in one clean wave. And here the story becomes more uncertain than older histories of the cat often allowed. For many years, a persuasive scientific reconstruction seemed to provide a relatively simple answer. Cats had entered close relationships with humans in the Near East during the Neolithic. Farming populations expanded. Cats, or their ancestors, expanded with them. Much later, Egyptian cats contributed another major wave of dispersal through Mediterranean and maritime networks. Ancient DNA seemed to support important parts of this picture. A major paleogenetic study, published in 2017, examined genetic material from ancient cats across thousands of years. Its results suggested two broad expansions: an early Near Eastern associated spread and a later expansion involving Egyptian associated cats that became widely distributed through the Old World. This fitted the archaeological story elegantly. Agriculture had produced the niche. Near Eastern cats had entered it. Farmers had carried them outward. Egypt later amplified the process through its enormous cultural and commercial connections. It was neat. History has an unfortunate habit of becoming less neat when more evidence appears. In late 2025, a new whole genome study substantially challenged the older reconstruction of how domestic cats entered Europe. Researchers examined dozens of ancient and modern feline genomes and found that the cats of prehistoric Europe, previously assumed to represent early domestic populations, did not fit the expected story. According to this newer evidence, clearly domestic cat ancestry appears in Europe much later, around 2,000 years ago, with strong connections to North African wildcat populations. That pushes the major establishment of domestic cats in Europe toward the historical period, rather than deep into the European Neolithic. It also gives North Africa a potentially much larger role. This does not erase the early relationship represented by Cyprus. It does not mean Near Eastern farming communities had nothing to do with feline commensalism. And it does not provide a magical new date on which the first domestic cat suddenly appeared. Instead, it tells us something more useful. We are still figuring this out. The history of the cat is being rewritten, while cats themselves sit in our houses looking remarkably unconcerned. The disagreement exists partly because domestication is not always a single event. We like clean beginnings. The first city, the first king, the first domesticated cat. But biology rarely organizes itself for our convenience. There may have been different populations, different degrees of tameness, repeated human-feline relationships, local wildcat interbreeding, movements by land and sea, populations that flourished and disappeared, and later, populations that replaced or absorbed earlier ones. The modern domestic cat may be the surviving result of a much messier history than a single birthplace suggests. China gives us an especially useful reminder of this. At Neolithic farming sites in China, archaeologists found feline remains that initially raised the possibility of an independent, early domestic cat story. The animals were living in landscapes where agriculture again created concentrated food and rodent populations. It looked familiar, but later, scientific analysis revealed something unexpected. These were not early examples of the domestic species that now occupies Chinese homes. They were leopard cats, Prionylurus bengalensis. A different feline had apparently entered a similar ecological relationship with agricultural communities. For a time, another cat-like predator seems to have occupied the niche. Eventually, Felis catus became the domestic cat of China instead. This is one of the most revealing details in the entire story, because it suggests that the human agricultural world itself was creating a recurring opportunity. Humans had, without intending to, invented a job. The job description was fairly simple. Be small enough to live near people. Be tolerant enough not to flee permanently. Be independent enough not to require much management. And above all, kill the animals eating our stored food. In different places, different small predators could potentially apply. The lineage that ultimately succeeded on a global scale was the one leading to the domestic cat. This also helps explain why calling cat domestication entirely human-directed is misleading. The cat was not passive material. Its own ecology made the relationship possible. A sheep cannot simply decide that a human village offers an excellent professional opportunity. A wildcat could. It could approach or retreat. It could hunt without permission. It could reproduce around settlements. It could remain close while retaining a substantial degree of independence. Humans could influence which animals survived near them, deliberately or unintentionally, but for a very long time they appear to have exerted far less pressure on feline appearance than they did on many other domestic species. That is visible in the genes. One of the striking findings of ancient cat DNA research concerns coat patterns. Today, domestic cats come in an extraordinary variety of colors, markings, coat lengths, body types, and increasingly specialized breeds. It is easy to project that diversity backward and imagine ancient settlements filled with something resembling a modern cat show. The evidence suggests otherwise. Genetic variants associated with particular decorative coat patterns became common surprisingly late. The mutation associated with the blotched tabby pattern, for example, rose to substantial frequency only long after cats had already spent millennia around humans, becoming especially visible after the medieval period. For most of their shared history, people seem not to have cared enough about feline appearance to reshape it aggressively. A farmer protecting grain does not need a cat with an especially round face. A sailor concerned about rodents does not need a particular coat color. A storekeeper does not benefit because the mouse's ears meet a breed standard. What matters is that the cat remains capable of doing what brought it into the human environment in the first place: hunt. And so the animal remains unusually close to its ancestral design. That ancestral design was particularly useful after sunset. The early farming settlement changed with darkness. Human visibility declined sharply once daylight disappeared. Fire could extend activity, but firelight is local. Beyond a hearth or lamp, interiors and exterior spaces quickly return to shadow. Rodents had no reason to respect human sleeping hours. They could move through storage areas while people rested. The cat, however, possessed senses suited to those hours. Its hearing could detect movements too small for a sleepy human to notice. Its eyes functioned effectively in low light. Its whiskers helped it navigate close spaces. Its paws allowed it to move with relatively little noise. The animal could therefore provide its greatest practical service precisely when humans were least able to supervise it. That, too, shaped the relationship. Humans did not need a cat to stand obediently beside them all day. They needed it to disappear into the parts of the settlement where mice were hiding. Independence was not necessarily a defect. It was part of the usefulness. And perhaps this is where the cat's later cultural reputation begins to make sense. For thousands of years, people would repeatedly notice the same qualities. The cat sees things in darkness. It hears what we cannot hear. It disappears and returns. It sits perfectly still and then moves with astonishing speed. It kills without being ordered to kill. It can live beside humans without appearing entirely subject to them. Those qualities would eventually become religious symbols, moral suspicions, folklore, jokes, and superstition. But before any of that, they were simply useful. A small predator was patrolling the edges of human life. It did not yet belong completely inside. It did not need to. And then, in one particular civilization along the Nile, humans began leaving us enough images, objects, burials, and texts to see the relationship much more clearly. There, the cat would move beneath household chairs and through granaries. It would appear in tomb paintings. Its body would be cast in bronze and decorated with jewelry. It would become associated with divine protection. And in one of the strangest contradictions in the history of human affection for animals, some cats would become so religiously valuable that people bred them in enormous numbers, killed them, wrapped them in linen, and offered them to the gods. The quiet hunter at the edge of the village was about to become sacred. By the time cats become clearly visible in the surviving world of ancient Egypt, something important has changed. The small predator that had once benefited from remaining near human settlements was no longer merely near them. In Egyptian art, cats appear inside the human world, beneath chairs, beside families, in hunting scenes, among the objects and animals chosen to accompany images of life and death. And this is where a familiar statement about ancient Egypt needs to be handled carefully. The Egyptians did not simply worship cats in the sense that every ordinary cat wandering through a courtyard was regarded as a god. The reality was more complicated and much more interesting. Cats could be useful animals. They could be household companions. They could carry religious meaning. They could be associated with divine powers. Their bodies could become votive offerings. Their images could be cast in bronze, decorated with jewelry, and deposited in sacred places. A cat might live close to people because it killed mice. Another might appear beneath the chair of an elite woman in a tomb painting. Another might be represented as a manifestation of protective, divine force. And another, born into a religious economy centuries later, might be deliberately killed, mummified, and offered to a deity. All of these relationships could exist within the same civilization. To understand why, it helps to begin with something less glamorous than a temple: grain. Egypt depended upon the agricultural rhythms of the Nile, and agriculture produced exactly the environment in which cats had already demonstrated their value. Harvested food had to be gathered, transported, and stored. Storage attracted animals that wanted to eat it. Mice and rats did not become less troublesome because a society had become wealthy, literate, or administratively sophisticated. If anything, large concentrations of food created larger opportunities. A granary is useful only while its contents remain available to the people who filled it. Rodents turn stored wealth back into uncertainty. They eat, they contaminate, they hide, and they tend to work very effectively in spaces that humans find inconvenient to patrol. A cat required no written instruction from a granary official. It already knew what to do. Egyptian cats were also useful against other unwanted small animals, including snakes, and this practical relationship between feline predation and household protection helps explain why the animal could acquire meanings that went far beyond pest control. A cat did something valuable in a distinctly feline way. It watched, it waited, then it attacked. The behavior was ordinary enough to observe around a household, yet dramatic enough to become symbolic. Ancient Egyptian imagery sometimes enlarges that familiar behavior into something cosmic. In a well-known image from the Book of the Dead, associated with the tomb of Senegem. A feline attacks a serpent. The image operates within a religious world far larger than the ordinary business of keeping pests away from stored food. But the underlying animal behavior remains recognizable. A cat kills something dangerous. Human beings give that act another meaning. This process occurs repeatedly throughout feline history. People watch what cats naturally do, and then use those behaviors to explain things that have little to do with mice. Their nocturnal activity becomes mystery. Their hunting becomes vigilance. Their fertility becomes a source of symbolism. Their controlled violence becomes protection. Their independence becomes, depending on the culture observing them, either admirable or suspicious. In Egypt, one of the most important divine associations eventually centered upon Bastet. Bastet's history itself changed over time. Egyptian religion was not a fixed system preserved unchanged for thousands of years, and the feline imagery surrounding deities developed along with it. Bastet became strongly associated with the domestic feline form and with ideas that could include protection, fertility, motherhood, and prosperity. One useful way to understand her is through a contrast with another feline deity, Sekhmet. Sekhmet appears in lioness form and embodies a far more dangerous expression of divine power. Destructive, violent, capable of devastation, Bastet could represent feline power in a more controlled and protective form. The contrast is striking because the Egyptians had access to both versions of the feline family. They knew large cats, and they knew the smaller animal living close to human beings. The house cat was not harmless. Anyone who has attempted to pick up a cat at precisely the moment the cat has decided not to be picked up can confirm that domestication did not remove all of its weaponry. But its dangerous capacities existed at a scale humans could tolerate inside domestic life. The lioness embodied feline power that could destroy you. The house cat embodied a similar predatory design reduced to a creature that might sit beneath your chair. That location beneath the chair is not hypothetical. Some of the most intimate evidence for cats in ancient Egypt comes from tomb art in which they appear within domestic scenes. At the tomb of Anan from the New Kingdom, for example, a cat appears beneath the chair of Queen Tiye. Other Egyptian images similarly place cats beneath women's chairs, sometimes alongside other animals associated with elite household life. For the history of cats, these quiet images may be more revealing than enormous monuments. A pyramid tells us about royal power, labor, religion, and death. A cat beneath a chair tells us something about floor space. It tells us that the animal had entered the arrangement of the household deeply enough to be represented where people sat. The cat is not painted somewhere outside chasing vermin. It occupies the human interior. And once an animal enters the household, its usefulness can gradually become entangled with affection. There is evidence that some Egyptian household animals were treated as individual companions and could receive names. We should still avoid turning every painted cat into the ancient equivalent of a modern pampered pet. The people represented in many surviving tomb scenes belong to social groups wealthy enough to commission elaborate funerary art, and their experience cannot simply be assigned to every farmer or laborer along the Nile. But neither can the evidence be dismissed. Some Egyptians clearly knew cats as individual animals living in close human company. We can see the result in the art. A cat beneath a chair is close enough to be stepped around, close enough to be observed while resting, close enough for its habits to become familiar. It is a different spatial relationship from the wildcat hunting at the edge of a Neolithic settlement. The distance between species is shrinking. Cats also appear in Egyptian hunting imagery, particularly scenes associated with the marsh environment. Such images must be interpreted carefully, because Egyptian tomb art could carry symbolic meanings beyond literal documentary reporting. We should not automatically treat every painted hunting cat as proof that ordinary Egyptians routinely trained cats exactly as someone might train a modern hunting dog. But the imagery again demonstrates something important. The Egyptians were paying attention to feline hunting behavior. They knew the cat as an animal capable of sudden violence in an environment of reeds, birds, and small prey. The household companion had not stopped being a predator. Indeed, that may have been part of its appeal. Later, cultures would sometimes become uncomfortable with precisely this mixture. An animal close enough to share domestic space, yet still visibly equipped for killing. Egypt could make that contradiction protective. The cat controlled what entered the household. It dealt with creatures humans did not want near: food, children, sleeping areas, or storage. And the animal's ordinary usefulness could merge with religious ideas about protection. Eventually, this relationship became tangible in metal. Thousands of years later, some of the most recognizable surviving objects from ancient Egypt are bronze feline figures. They often show a cat seated upright. The front legs are straight, the ears are alert, the tail is arranged close to the body. Some are small enough to hold easily. Others are considerably more elaborate. Certain examples have pierced ears, where earrings could be attached. Some wear collars or protective amulets. Their surfaces could carry details connecting an ordinary feline body with a sacred identity. The famous object, known today as the Geyer-Anderson cat, is among the finest surviving examples. It is made principally of copper alloy and depicts a seated feline with carefully rendered jewelry. Scientific analysis has even allowed researchers to investigate the composition of the metal itself, revealing an alloy dominated by copper with substantial tin and smaller quantities of other elements. That technical detail matters less than what the object tells us about attention. Someone had to model this animal. Metal had to be prepared. The figure had to be cast. Its surface had to be finished. Decorative details had to be created. The familiar outline of a sitting cat had become worthy of considerable human labor. This is another turning point in the relationship. The first wildcats did not need humans to make anything for them. They arrived because humans had inadvertently made something for mice. Now humans were making cats out of bronze. Some feline statuettes were associated directly with Bastet. They could be offered at temples or sacred sites, material expressions of religious devotion connecting worshippers with the deity. And as the cult of sacred animals expanded, particularly in later periods of Egyptian history, the relationship became economically complicated. A worshipper might want to make an animal offering that created demand. Demand required supply, and supply could be organized. Cats were bred in substantial numbers in connection with religious institutions and votive practices. Their bodies could be mummified and deposited in sacred contexts, including the enormous animal burial complexes known from sites such as Bubastis and Saqqara. This is where modern expectations about sacred animals begin to fail. We tend to assume that if an animal is sacred, the logical response is to preserve its life. Ancient Egyptian votive practice could operate according to a very different logic. The animal's religious value could be realized through its death. Some cats were killed specifically so that they could be mummified and offered. This is not an accusation reconstructed from hostile ancient writers. Modern scientific examination of animal mummies has provided direct physical evidence. Researchers using techniques such as computed tomography and micro-CT scanning can examine the contents of wrapped animal mummies without dismantling them in the way earlier investigators sometimes did. The wrappings can remain in place while the internal skeleton appears in 3 dimensions, and sometimes what appears inside is unsettling. In one detailed scientific investigation published in 2020, researchers examined a mummified cat that had died at less than roughly 5 months of age. The imaging showed evidence consistent with deliberate killing. Its neck had been broken. Other scientific examinations of Egyptian cat mummies have also identified cervical fractures, so there is no need to exaggerate the contradiction. The physical evidence already provides it. A civilization famous for the sacred status of cats also produced young cats whose lives were deliberately ended as part of systems of religious offering. But this does not mean that Egyptians were secretly indifferent to cats, nor that household pets were routinely taken away and killed for temples. The categories mattered. A companion animal and a votive animal could occupy very different positions, even if they belonged to the same species. The comparison with modern attitudes can easily mislead us because modern pet culture encourages us to assign a single moral category to an animal. We might think, if you love cats, you protect cats. If cats are sacred, you certainly do not kill them. Ancient Egyptian religion did not have to follow that logic. A votive animal could become valuable because it enabled an act of communication or devotion. Its body, prepared and deposited appropriately, became part of a religious transaction. And once enough people wanted to make such offerings, the system created a practical problem familiar from many periods of history. Where do all the animals come from? The answer appears to have included organized breeding. This transforms the sacred cat from an individual symbol into part of an economy. Animals need space. They need food. They reproduce. They have to be managed. If they are destined for mummification, their bodies must then be processed. Materials are required for wrapping and preparation. People perform the labor. Objects associated with the cult are manufactured. Worshippers arrive. Offerings are purchased or presented. Burial spaces fill. What began as an association between feline behavior and divine protection could therefore support an entire chain of human activity. The cat was now feeding people in a metaphorical sense as well, not by becoming food, but by creating work. Breeders, temple personnel, craftsmen, and others could participate in a system made possible by the religious importance of animals, and the scale could become enormous. Animal catacombs in Egypt contained extraordinary numbers of mummified creatures. Cats were only part of a much broader phenomenon that included ibises, crocodiles, dogs, and other animals associated with particular deities. The result can feel strange from a modern perspective. Long underground spaces filled with wrapped animal bodies, some carefully prepared, some containing incomplete remains, some associated with mass production rather than individualized burial. The contrast with the cat beneath Queen T's chair could hardly be greater. One image suggests an individual animal occupying intimate household space. The other system required cats in numbers large enough to become ritual commodities. Both are Egyptian. That is why the phrase, "Egyptians loved cats," is inadequate. Some certainly seem to have formed close relationships with individual cats. Egyptian religion also elevated feline symbolism to extraordinary importance, but neither statement explains the entire system. Affection, utility, religion, and exploitation could overlap without becoming identical. A Greek visitor to Egypt in the 5th century BCE left us a famous description of just how remarkable Egyptian treatment of cats appeared to outsiders. Herodotus reports that when a house caught fire, Egyptians were extraordinarily concerned about cats. According to his account, the animals sometimes attempted to leap into the flames while people formed lines to prevent them. He also claims that when a household cat died naturally, the people of the house shaved their eyebrows in mourning. Dead cats, he says, were taken to Bubastis, where they were embalmed and buried. These are memorable details, possibly too memorable. Herodotus was writing for Greek readers about a society whose customs often appeared exotic to them. His work is invaluable because it preserves observations and stories from the ancient world. But he was not a modern ethnographer conducting controlled surveys across every Egyptian village. So the responsible phrasing is not that every Egyptian family always shaved its eyebrows whenever a cat died. It is that Herodotus reports such a custom. The distinction may sound small, but it is one of the habits that keeps historical storytelling honest. Ancient writers were human beings. They misunderstood. They repeated stories. They emphasized what interested their audiences. They generalized. Sometimes they were remarkably accurate. Sometimes archaeology later complicates what they wrote. In this case, however, Herodotus's broader impression that cats could receive elaborate treatment after death fits a world that archaeology has made impossible to dismiss. The catacombs exist. The mummies exist. The bronze cats exist. The religious association with Bastet is abundantly documented. Whatever we make of eyebrow shaving, cats unquestionably occupied an extraordinary position in Egyptian life. And Bubastis was central to it. The city was associated especially closely with Bastet and became a major center of her cult. Pilgrimage, festival, and animal offering brought people into a shared religious landscape where the feline form carried meanings that would have been immediately recognizable. Yet it is worth remembering how far the cat had traveled conceptually by this point. The ancestral wildcat did not approach human settlements because it represented fertility. It came because prey was there. Humans did not originally need bronze statues of cats to protect grain. They needed living predators. Religion did not replace this practical relationship. It accumulated around it. That distinction is important because it shows how cultural meaning often grows from repeated material experience. An animal proves useful. People observe its behavior. The behavior acquires associations. The associations enter stories and ritual. Ritual produces objects. Objects produce industries. And eventually, the symbolic animal can become almost as important as the living one. The Egyptian cat therefore existed in several worlds at once. There was the biological animal, small, warm-blooded, predatory, reproducing, hunting, sleeping, and moving through buildings. There was the economic animal, protecting food from pests, and, later, participating in systems of breeding and votive production. There was the social animal, close enough to people to appear beneath chairs and within household imagery. And there was the religious animal, a body capable of representing protection, divine presence, and sacred exchange. The remarkable thing is that none of these identities completely erased the others. A bronze cat still looks like a cat. Its ears remain upright. Its paws remain arranged beneath the same predatory body. Divinity did not require transforming the animal beyond recognition. Egyptian artists could take the familiar posture of a creature people saw around them and allow it to carry enormous religious weight. That familiarity may have strengthened the symbolism. Bastet's animal was not hidden in some unreachable wilderness. Cats could live nearby. A divine association could therefore be encountered in ordinary space. And ordinary space mattered enormously in ancient Egyptian religion. Protection was not an abstract concern. Families faced illness. Children died. Women faced dangerous childbirth. Food could fail. Animals could enter homes. The Nile itself could bring prosperity or difficulty, depending on environmental conditions. A protective deity associated with a familiar household predator occupied a world where divine and practical protection did not need to be separate categories. The cat's reproductive behavior may also have contributed to associations involving fertility and motherhood. Anyone living around an unmanaged cat population would have had frequent opportunities to observe kittens and maternal behavior. Female cats can produce litters repeatedly under favorable conditions. To human observers without modern reproductive biology, the visible abundance of offspring and the attentive behavior of a mother cat could easily acquire symbolic significance. Again, humans were building cultural meanings out of behaviors the animal already possessed. They did not make the cat fertile. They noticed that it was. And yet, the same reproductive capacity that could suggest fertility also made large-scale religious breeding practical. A cat population can increase quickly when food and shelter are available. The biological trait that supports one symbolic interpretation can simultaneously support an economic system. This is why the history becomes richer when we resist dividing it neatly into practical and religious. For the people living inside that world, those categories were not necessarily separate. A cat could protect a grain store physically and evoke protection symbolically. It could be useful because it killed snakes, and meaningful because divine stories involved feline power. A household could care about a living animal, while a temple system produced animals for death. Contradictions that trouble us may not have troubled people in the same way. There was another important transformation occurring beyond Egypt as well. Cats were becoming mobile. Egypt sat within extensive networks connecting North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, and the wider ancient world. People moved goods. Ships moved food. Ports accumulated stores. Armies needed provisions. Merchants needed warehouses. Every one of these activities recreated, in some form, the old Neolithic problem. Concentrated food attracts rodents. A ship carrying grain is essentially a floating storage room, and a floating storage room has very limited space in which to tolerate mice. The advantages of a cat become obvious. A cat takes up relatively little room. It does not require a human handler to patrol the cargo with it. It can enter confined spaces. It can hunt at night. It can feed partly on the animals it is there to control. And unlike a mechanical trap, it can move to wherever the prey has gone. We should be careful not to imagine every Egyptian or classical vessel sailing with an officially appointed ship's cat perched neatly on deck. The evidence does not support that kind of universal scene, but genetics tells us that cats were moving through human networks. The older ancient DNA reconstruction identified an important Egyptian-associated expansion during later antiquity, with feline lineages appearing across increasingly distant parts of the Old World. The newer genomic evidence has complicated the exact origin story while making the importance of North Africa even harder to ignore. By around 2,000 years ago, domestic cat ancestry appears clearly in Europe, and this means that the next stage of the cat's history may have unfolded later than historians once assumed. The agricultural settlements of Europe had existed for millennia. Europeans certainly knew wildcats, but the domestic animal, whose descendants would eventually occupy medieval kitchens, monasteries, warehouses and bedrooms, may have spread widely through Europe only during the great interconnected world of classical antiquity and its aftermath. This changes the map. It also changes the rhythm. Instead of imagining one continuous feline migration following Europe's earliest farmers thousands of years earlier, we have to consider later networks connecting North Africa and the Mediterranean with European ports and settlements. Ships become more important. Trade becomes more important. Imperial infrastructure becomes more important. And rodents remain quietly important throughout. A cargo vessel could carry grain. It could carry oil or other provisions. Its timbers enclosed dark compartments. Rope, cloth, food stores, and confined spaces created an environment in which unwanted animals could survive alongside human cargo. We cannot reconstruct the smell and sound of every vessel, but the material conditions are straightforward enough. Wood moved and creaked under strain. Water entered places people would have preferred to keep dry. Food had to remain edible during journeys lasting far longer than modern transport. Below deck, natural light could be poor, and somewhere among those stores, rodents could feed. The cat was physically suited to this environment, in a way few other predators were. Its small body was an advantage. Its independence was an advantage. Its ability to operate in darkness was an advantage. Even its reproductive capacity was useful once cats reached a new settlement. Humans did not need to transport an endless supply if local populations could establish themselves. The animal that had once followed mice toward a farming village was now following human civilization across water. That movement would eventually create a very different cat. Not biologically different at first, culturally different. In Egypt, feline mystery could become divine protection. In parts of later Europe, some of those same qualities would be interpreted much less comfortably. The silent movement, the reflective eyes, the night activity, the refusal to behave like an obedient dog, the animal's ability to appear and disappear. These traits had not changed. Human interpretation would, and this is one of the central patterns of the cat's entire history. Cats keep doing recognizably feline things. People keep changing their minds about what those things mean. The Egyptians could look at a predator and see protection. Centuries later, another person could look at the same nocturnal independence and see something morally suspicious. Yet even then, there would be a mouse in the pantry, and that mouse would make it very difficult to reject the cat completely. So the sacred animal began to travel outward from the Mediterranean world, carried through systems built for entirely human purposes. Roads, ports, warehouses, military supply, commerce, ships. The cat needed none of these things for itself. But once humans built them, the animal could use them. The ancient partnership had discovered a new mechanism. Humans no longer merely created places where cats could live. They were beginning to carry cats from one human world into another. And somewhere ahead lay a continent where the animal would become both useful and unsettling, welcomed beside food stores and suspected in stories, loved by some households and associated by others with darkness, magic, and moral danger. Egypt had made the cat sacred. Medieval Europe would make it complicated. When domestic cats became established across Europe, they entered a world very different from Egypt. There were no great feline cult centers waiting for them, no bronze statues of Bastei, no vast, sacred catacombs. The cat's value became more ordinary again, tied to houses, barns, food stores, monasteries, ports, and the persistent problem of rodents. But something else happened as well. The same qualities that had once inspired protective symbolism in Egypt could now acquire a darker reputation. The cat moved at night. It watched from shadow. It did not obey in the manner of a dog. It slipped in and out of buildings with little explanation. Its pupils widened strangely in low light. Its body could remain almost motionless for a long time and then erupt into sudden violence. It hunted alone. To a medieval household, these were practical characteristics. To a moralist, a storyteller, or someone thinking in terms of sin, temptation, magic, and hidden forces, they could become something else. And so, the medieval cat developed one of the most contradictory reputations in animal history. It could be useful and suspicious, affectionate and morally questionable. A companion in one room and a symbol of danger in another. This contradiction is important because the popular version of medieval history often flattens everything into a single claim, that medieval Europeans hated cats. They did not. Some feared them. Some associated them with troubling ideas. Some wrote about them in negative ways. But other people kept them, fed them, watched them, drew them, wrote affectionately about them, and depended on them to kill mice. The medieval cat survived, not in spite of contradiction, but inside it. The practical reason was obvious. Rodents had not gone anywhere. A household storing grain, cheese, dried food, seeds, cloth, parchment, or other vulnerable materials still had the same ancient problem that Neolithic farmers had faced thousands of years earlier. Small animals could enter spaces humans could not easily reach. And in the medieval world, the consequences of rodent damage could extend well beyond food. Consider a monastery. A monastic community might contain stores of grain, kitchens, sleeping quarters, workshops, and manuscripts. The manuscripts matter. A medieval book was not cheap. It represented animal skin processed into parchment, hours of preparation, ink, copying, illumination, binding, and skilled labor. A single volume could embody an extraordinary investment of time. Mice did not care. To them, storage rooms, shelves, binding materials, scraps, and warm enclosed buildings offered opportunities. A cat wandering through such a place could protect more than dinner. It could protect knowledge. This gives us some of the most charming evidence from the Middle Ages. Cats appear in manuscripts not only as symbols, but as familiar animals. They chase mice in margins. They play. They appear in comic scenes. They occupy the same visual world as monks, scribes, householders, and other animals. This familiarity matters. Artists were not drawing a mysterious beast they barely knew. They understood feline posture. They understood the crouch before a pounce. They understood the irritating fascination cats could have with string. They understood that a cat near a mouse creates a story almost automatically. And some medieval writers clearly regarded cats as useful companions. One surviving tradition praises the cat as a kind of nocturnal guard, hunting the thieves that moved in dark corners while humans slept. The description is practical, but it also reveals something about the medieval experience of night. Darkness was much more complete than it is for most modern listeners. A medieval interior did not remain evenly visible after sunset. A hearth gave light, but only around itself. A candle could illuminate a small space while leaving the rest of a room in shadow. Rushlights and oil lamps extended activity where available, but none of these created the constant ambient brightness of electric lighting. A person moving through a house at night entered alternating zones of visibility and darkness. The cat did not experience this darkness in the same way. Its eyes and other senses were adapted for conditions in which humans became less capable. That difference could be useful. It could also be unsettling. Human beings are particularly good at turning another animal's sensory advantage into a story about hidden knowledge. If a cat stares into a corner where you see nothing, it is easy to imagine that the cat knows something you do not. If it suddenly lifts its head at a sound you cannot hear, the same thought appears. If it disappears into the dark and later returns without explanation, the animal seems to occupy part of the night unavailable to you. For a medieval person living in a culture where the supernatural was woven deeply into explanations of misfortune, morality, illness, temptation, and divine order, these qualities offered abundant material. But the cat did not need to become supernatural to remain useful. That is the contradiction. A preacher might distrust what the animal symbolized. A householder might still want it near the pantry. And medieval society produced both responses. Cats appear in religious and moral literature in ways that could be unflattering. Their stealth, predation, sexuality, and apparent independence made them useful symbols for behavior humans regarded with suspicion. A cat waiting quietly beside a mouse hole could become an image of deceptive patience. Its nocturnal habits could become associated with secrecy. Its hunting could be turned into allegory. And because medieval bestiaries and moral traditions frequently used animals as tools for explaining human behavior, the actual cat was never merely an animal on the page. It could become a lesson. This was not unique to cats. Medieval people assigned elaborate moral meanings to many animals, often blending observation with inherited stories, religious interpretation, and traditions reaching back to antiquity. But cats were particularly flexible symbols because their real behavior already seemed ambiguous. A dog often advertises its social intentions. A cat can sit near you without looking at you. It can accept food and still leave. It can seek touch and then refuse it. It can spend hours apparently inactive and then become intensely predatory. To humans who value visible loyalty, this can look like emotional uncertainty, and uncertainty is fertile ground for symbolism. The association between cats and darker supernatural ideas became more visible over time, especially in late medieval and early modern Europe. Cats could become linked with witchcraft, demonic forces, female sexuality, heresy, and magical practice. But here we need to slow down, because this is where modern internet history often becomes much more dramatic than the evidence. There was no single moment when all of medieval Europe collectively decided that cats were evil. There was no universal anti-cat policy applied across every kingdom, town, village, monastery, and household. There were regional differences, chronological differences, differences between elite writing and ordinary behavior, differences between what religious authorities said and what households actually did. And those differences are precisely what make the story more interesting. One religious text might associate cats with dangerous or immoral forces. A household in the same broad cultural world might still feed one because mice were eating the grain. A noblewoman might keep a cat as a favored companion. A manuscript artist might make a joke about one. A monastery might value one because rodents damaged precious materials. The cat did not occupy one medieval category. It moved between categories, much as it moved between rooms. There is also direct evidence that some cats were cherished. Elite households could keep cats as companion animals, and late medieval accounts preserve examples of individuals treating them with obvious affection. One such example involves Isabella d'Este, who received a small cat described as delicate enough to make its home in her arms. This is elite evidence and should remain what it is. It does not prove that every peasant household treated cats as lap animals, but it makes one point very clearly. Affection for cats did not disappear. People could love the same animal that cultural traditions sometimes treated with suspicion. In fact, this tension may have made the cat more culturally durable. Animals that fit neatly into one symbolic category are less interesting. Cats rarely do. They could be connected with household femininity and domestic space, while also appearing as predators. They could be useful and independent. They could be physically small and symbolically dangerous. They could be cuddled by one person and distrusted by another. And unlike mythical creatures, they remained stubbornly present in daily life. The cat sitting beside the grain store did not care what a theologian had written about feline morality. It still had mice to catch. The strongest modern myth about medieval cats takes this real history of suspicion and turns it into a simple causal chain. According to the popular version, European religious authorities condemned cats. People then killed enormous numbers of them. Rat populations exploded. The Black Death arrived. Fewer cats meant more rats, and therefore human hatred of cats helped cause or dramatically worsen the plague. It is an excellent story. It has irony. It has punishment. Humans persecute the animal that protects them, and nature retaliates. Unfortunately, the historical evidence does not support such a clean explanation. The Black Death was one of the most devastating disease events in human history. But its ecology was far more complicated than the equation of cat numbers and rat numbers suggests. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, moved through systems involving fleas, hosts, trade networks, environmental conditions, and human movement. Rodents played an important role in many plague systems, but historians and scientists continue to examine how transmission functioned in different outbreaks and regions. Human ectoparasites may have contributed in some contexts. Different rodent species may have mattered in different places. Cats themselves can acquire plague. And most importantly for our story, there is not good evidence for a continent-wide medieval extermination of cats on a scale sufficient to establish the tidy sequence found in popular retellings. The myth takes several separate truths and stitches them together too confidently. Some medieval religious material did treat cats negatively. Some cats were killed in violent or symbolic contexts. Rodents could carry fleas involved in plague ecology. Cats kill rodents. All of those statements can be true without proving that religious hostility to cats caused the Black Death. This is a useful example of how attractive historical stories survive. They have moral shape. The past becomes a fable. People behave foolishly. Consequences follow. Justice arrives. Real history is usually less cooperative. And in the case of medieval cats, the evidence points not toward universal hatred, but toward coexistence. The cat remained inside European life because its usefulness remained obvious. A mouse in a sack of grain is a practical argument stronger than most theology. This was particularly true in towns. Medieval urban environments created excellent opportunities for rodents. Food moved through markets. Grain passed into storehouses. Waste accumulated. Animals lived near people. Buildings contained walls, floors, cellars, lofts, and narrow spaces. The density of human settlement created exactly the kind of ecological concentration that cats had exploited since the first agricultural villages. Urbanization did not make the cat obsolete. It gave it more rooms to patrol. The medieval town also intensified another side of the relationship. The cat did not belong entirely to one household in the modern sense. Cats could move between private and semi-public space. A cat might be fed in one place and hunt in another. It might reproduce without controlled breeding. Ownership could be loose. The modern expectation that a pet belongs to one household, receives measured food, veterinary care, identification, sterilization, and controlled access to the outdoors belongs to a much later world. A medieval cat could exist somewhere between household animal, working mouser, and semi-independent neighborhood predator. That ambiguity suited its biology. The cat did not need humans to plan its day. If prey existed nearby, it could work for itself. And this relative independence helped cats spread through the human landscape without requiring the enormous administrative systems needed for livestock. No pasture had to be assigned. No cart had to transport fodder. No stable had to be constructed on the scale required for horses. The cat was cheap to keep, partly because it continued acquiring some of its own food. That does not mean people never fed cats directly. They did. But the animal's ability to supplement human food with hunting reduced the burden of keeping it. For poorer households, that mattered. The cat could remain valuable even when resources were limited. Its small body demanded less food than a large dog. Its usefulness continued at night, and it reproduced without deliberate breeding programs. This combination made the species difficult to remove, even where cultural suspicion existed. There was another reason cats remained close to people. They were simply interesting to watch. This sounds trivial, beside plague, religion, and subsistence, but it should not be dismissed. Human beings repeatedly record animals that capture their attention. Medieval manuscript margins are full of visual humor, absurdity, and observation. Cats fit naturally into this world. They chase. They fail. They steal. They stare. They curl into compact shapes. They attack things much smaller than themselves with enormous seriousness. They become distracted. They behave with enough independence that humans can easily interpret their actions as personality. The internet would eventually discover that these qualities are almost perfectly suited to short-form entertainment, but medieval artists had already noticed them. A cat chasing a mouse in a manuscript margin is, at a basic level, the ancestor of the modern cat video. The technology changes. The human reaction does not. The medieval viewer did not need to know anything about domestication genetics to find a feline hunt amusing or familiar. The animal was part of everyday visual culture. And this suggests something important about companionship. Humans do not need an animal to perform an economically essential function before they begin to enjoy its behavior. Utility may have brought cats closer. Familiarity made room for something else. Once an animal occupies your building generation after generation, people begin to recognize individuals. One cat is more tolerant. Another is a better hunter. One seeks human contact. Another remains distant. One sleeps in a particular place. One steals food. One disappears for days. Individual personality emerges from repeated observation. This does not require modern pet ideology. It requires only proximity and memory. The distinction matters because modern culture often assumes that working animal and pet are separate categories. Historically, they could overlap. A cat could catch mice and still be favored. A horse could work and still be loved. A dog could guard and still be mourned. Practical value does not prevent emotional attachment. Sometimes it creates the conditions for it. This is why medieval evidence should not be divided too sharply into good attitudes and bad attitudes. A person might believe a cat carried troubling symbolic associations and still tolerate a useful individual. Another might repeat a folk belief without acting upon it. Official doctrine does not automatically describe daily behavior. Law does not always describe enforcement. Symbolism does not always describe affection, and the medieval cat lived in the gap between these things. This gap becomes especially important when we consider women. Later, European traditions increasingly connected cats with femininity, sexuality, domestic space, and eventually witchcraft. These associations did not appear from nowhere, but they accumulated unevenly. Cats were often present in households, and women were deeply involved in domestic labor, food preparation, childcare, textile work, and household management. The animal's location within domestic interiors could therefore contribute to gendered cultural meanings. Later, witchcraft traditions could transform that proximity into suspicion. But again, we should avoid pretending there was one continuous, inevitable line from woman with cat to witch with familiar. Historical associations developed gradually and differed across places. The familiar image of the witch's cat belongs especially to later medieval and early modern imagination, rather than to all centuries equally. Still, the connection would become powerful. Why cats? Partly because the animal already possessed a repertoire that looked mysterious to humans. It moved silently. It was often active at night. It could stare for long periods. It could vanish outdoors. Its mating behavior could be noisy and disturbing. Its independence made it difficult to control. And black-coated animals, in particular traditions, could accumulate associations with darkness. None of these behaviors were supernatural. That is precisely the point. Ordinary biology became material for extraordinary interpretation. The same thing had happened in Egypt, but with a different result. There, predation and feline power could feed ideas of divine protection. In parts of Christian Europe, nocturnal independence could feed ideas of danger, secrecy, and moral uncertainty. The cat did not change. The human symbolic world did. This contrast is one of the most valuable ways to understand animal history. We often ask why a culture believed something about an animal, as though the belief had appeared independently. But people build symbolism out of observation. A lion's strength becomes royal power. A snake's shedding becomes renewal or deception. A cat's darkness, quietness, fertility, and autonomy become whatever a particular society is prepared to see in them. The medieval cat is therefore not simply the victim of superstition, it is a mirror. Its reputation reveals what human beings thought about order. Dogs tended to fit more comfortably into hierarchical ideas because visible obedience was easy to understand. Cats did not. They accepted proximity without surrendering all independence. A human could feed a cat and still fail to command it. That is not rebellion in the political sense. But human societies are remarkably good at moralizing animal behavior. The cat's refusal to behave like a small dog could become evidence of character. And yet, while writers moralized, ordinary cats continued doing ordinary work. In grain stores, they hunted. In kitchens, they waited for scraps. Around monasteries, they pursued mice. In barns, they reproduced. In streets, they moved between human territories and their own. At night, they occupied the parts of buildings where people saw poorly. The relationship survived because it did not require ideological agreement. A farmer did not need to admire cats in principle. He only needed to notice fewer mice. And as centuries passed, Europe itself changed. Towns grew, trade expanded, households changed. Printed books gradually replaced the world in which every manuscript represented months of hand labor. New economic systems developed. New ideas about domestic comfort appeared. Eventually, the cat's ancient job as mouser would become less central in many urban households. This could have weakened the relationship. Instead, something unexpected happened. The cat remained. Once human beings had spent centuries sharing space with an animal, usefulness was no longer the only reason to keep it. By the early modern and modern periods, cats increasingly entered a new social world in which companionship, appearance, and personality could matter as much as hunting ability. And that shift would become dramatic in the 19th century. Industrial cities changed human homes. Middle-class domestic life became a cultural ideal. Furniture became more elaborate. Parlors became places of display. Animal welfare movements changed the moral vocabulary around pets. Print culture circulated images of companion animals. And people began doing something with cats that their Neolithic ancestors would probably have found incomprehensible. They began judging them by appearance, not simply whether the animal was healthy, not whether it was an efficient mouser, but whether its coat was attractive, whether its body met expectations, whether one type of cat could be distinguished from another, whether a particular animal was worthy of a prize. This was the beginning of the modern cat as a designed object of taste. For thousands of years, humans had largely preserved the animal's wild competence. Now they were preparing to redesign its surface. The medieval cat had lived in shadow, useful and suspicious, affectionate and independent. The Victorian cat would step into the light of the exhibition hall. By the 19th century, the cat had already spent thousands of years earning its place beside human beings. It had protected grain stores. It had crossed seas. It had lived in Egyptian houses and medieval monasteries. It had been sacred, suspicious, practical, affectionate, and occasionally unlucky enough to become part of someone else's superstition. But the 19th century introduced a different kind of relationship. Humans began looking at cats and asking not only, "What can this animal do?" They began asking, "What should this animal look like?" That sounds like a small change. It was not. For most of cat history, usefulness had placed limits on how much humans could alter the animal. A mouser needed to remain agile. A shipboard cat needed to move through tight spaces. A barn cat needed to see, hear, climb, stalk, and kill efficiently. A cat that looked unusual was interesting, only if it could still behave like a cat. Victorian domestic culture gradually loosened that requirement. As cities expanded and more people lived in homes increasingly separated from direct food production, the ancient economic justification for keeping a cat weakened in some households. There were still mice. There were still warehouses, shops, stables, and working cats. But in middle-class homes, a cat could remain even when nobody depended on it to protect the winter grain supply. The animal was beginning to survive the decline of its original job. That transition is one of the most important in the entire story. The cat had been invited inside because it was useful. It stayed because people liked having it there. The setting for this change was the increasingly elaborate 19th century home. In many middle-class interiors, domestic space became a display of order, comfort, taste, and respectability. Furniture mattered. Textiles mattered. Objects mattered. Rooms acquired specialized functions. A parlor was not merely somewhere to sit. It was somewhere to receive visitors and reveal something about the household. Animals entered this world too. A cat lying near a fireplace or on upholstered furniture belonged visually to a new ideal of domestic comfort. The animal that had once stalked mice among sacks of grain could now become part of the furniture arrangement. That did not make cats decorative objects in a simple sense. They remained active animals with claws, fur, appetites, and their own ideas about where to sit. Indeed, one of the quiet comedies of pet keeping is that the more carefully humans arrange domestic space, the more satisfying it appears to become for cats to ignore the intended arrangement. A chair becomes a bed. A windowsill becomes a lookout. A folded garment becomes immediately preferable to an expensive cushion. The animal adapts to domestic comfort without necessarily respecting its rules. Victorian society did something else with cats that earlier households had rarely done systematically. It classified them. People began to distinguish cats not merely as good or poor hunters, friendly or difficult individuals, but as types: coat color, hair length, body shape, head shape, markings, temperament, origin stories. Aesthetic preference slowly turned into formal standards. And once humans create standards, competition usually follows. In 1871, a famous cat show was held at the Crystal Palace in London. It is often treated as one of the foundational moments of organised cat fancy. The setting itself was almost absurdly different from the cat's ancient world. There were no grain bins to defend, no mouse holes that needed immediate attention, no farm household waiting to see whether the animal could earn its keep. Cats were brought into an exhibition space so that humans could compare them. Judges assessed appearance. Visitors looked. Some cats became more valuable because of traits that had no particular usefulness in hunting. The logic of domestication had changed. A Neolithic farmer benefits from a cat because it is an efficient predator. A Victorian exhibitor may benefit because the same animal has the correct coat. That shift tells us something broader about industrial society. Once a household has enough surplus to keep an animal for companionship, taste becomes possible. Once breeding is organized around taste, humans can begin shaping the animal according to preferences that have little to do with survival. And this is where modern cat breeds begin to take recognizable form. The Persian, the Siamese, the British Shorthair, and eventually many others. It is important not to project these modern breed identities backward through history. Ancient Egypt did not contain a neat catalogue of modern breeds. Medieval Europe was not divided into British Shorthairs and Persians in the contemporary sense. For most of the shared history between humans and cats, populations were far more fluid. Local cats bred with local cats. Appearance varied, but organized pedigree breeding was limited. Genetic research supports just how late strong aesthetic selection became. One of the most familiar modern coat patterns, the blotched tabby, appears to have become common only after the medieval period. That means something visually obvious to a modern owner may be historically recent. Humans had already lived with cats for thousands of years before coat pattern became an important target of selection. This is striking when compared with dogs. Dogs had been reshaped into radically different forms for work and companionship. Cats remained much closer to the body plan of their wild ancestors. The 19th century changed that, but only partially. Even selectively bred cats still generally retained a recognizable feline structure. The change was more visible at the surface: coat length, color, facial proportion, body type, ear shape. The animal became increasingly subject to human taste, and taste can create inconvenience. A coat selected for appearance may require grooming. A body selected for an extreme shape may not be well suited to the same physical life as a working mouser. The more humans breed for visual distinction, the more they risk separating the animal from the qualities that originally made it successful. This tension would become much more important in later pet culture. But the Victorian transformation was not only about appearance, it was also about moral status. The 19th century saw expanding movements concerned with animal welfare and the treatment of companion animals. Cruelty that earlier generations might have accepted more casually became increasingly subject to criticism. Pet keeping became connected with ideas about gentleness, domestic virtue, and humane behavior. This changed how people wrote about cats. They appeared in stories, illustrations, sentimental images, advertisements, and household literature. Children saw cats not only as practical animals, but as companions. Adults increasingly spoke about individual personality. A cat could be mischievous, lazy, elegant, jealous, affectionate, proud, difficult. In reality, people had noticed feline individuality long before the 19th century. What changed was the cultural space available for talking about it. A cat no longer needed to justify its presence exclusively through work. Personality itself could become valuable. This is an enormous step toward the modern pet. And once personality becomes part of the animal's value, age matters differently too. A poor mouser might once have been replaced. An elderly pet may be kept precisely because it is the same individual a household has known for years. The relationship becomes biographical. Humans remember the kitten. They remember habits. They remember where the animal sleeps. They compare the current cat with previous cats. The animal accumulates personal history. That kind of relationship is difficult to measure archaeologically, but modern domestic culture makes it increasingly visible. The cat also begins moving deeper into the house. This sounds almost too ordinary to matter. It matters enormously. A working animal that comes indoors occasionally creates one kind of domestic problem. A permanent indoor animal creates another. It has to eat inside, sleep inside, scratch inside, shed hair inside, become ill inside, and, most awkwardly, eliminate waste inside. The fully indoor cat therefore depends on technology. A 19th century household without modern litter products could still keep a cat indoors. But the practical difficulties were greater. Sand, ashes, earth, or other absorbent materials could be used. These worked. They also produced odor, dust, moisture, and unpleasant cleaning. A cat allowed outdoors could simply leave the house to relieve itself. A cat permanently confined indoors could not. This is one of those small historical inconveniences that rarely appears in grand narratives, but helps explain why domestic behavior changes only when supporting systems change. The house cat is not created by affection alone. It requires waste management. The same is true of food. For much of history, a cat could eat household scraps and supplement its diet by hunting. That arrangement works better when the animal has access to prey. The modern apartment cat, living several floors above a city street, cannot rely on hunting. Its existence depends on a supply chain. Meat or other ingredients must be produced somewhere else, processed, packaged, transported, sold, carried into the home, placed in a bowl. The predator remains, but its prey has been industrialized. This change began gradually. Commercial pet foods expanded during the 19th and 20th centuries, making it easier for owners to feed animals without depending on scraps or hunting. Once food becomes reliable, the cat can live in environments where its original ecological job no longer exists. The high-rise apartment is possible because the mouse has been replaced by the can. Not entirely, of course. Many urban cats still hunted. Farm cats continued to work. Warehouses still benefited from feline predators. But the spectrum widened. There were now cats kept primarily for companionship, cats kept primarily for work, and many living somewhere in between. The modern pet world would eventually favor the first category. Another major transformation came through veterinary medicine. A working animal with a serious illness historically faced uncertain odds. Treatment existed in various forms, but the specialized veterinary system familiar to modern pet owners was limited. As veterinary practice expanded, companion animals increasingly entered a medical world, once focused heavily on economically valuable livestock and horses. Cats could receive diagnosis, treatment, vaccination, surgery, eventually, increasingly sophisticated care. The cultural meaning of this is profound. Humans were now spending money to preserve the life of an animal that did not necessarily produce anything economically measurable in return. That would have been difficult to explain in purely agricultural terms. In emotional terms, it makes perfect sense. The cat had become a member of the household, and once an animal enters that category, medical expenditure becomes part of care. The same shift occurred with reproduction. A useful population of working cats can reproduce with relatively little human interference. That can also become a problem very quickly. Cats reproduce efficiently. Where food and shelter are available, populations can increase. That means kittens, more kittens, unwanted kittens, mating behavior, territorial conflict, noise, competition. A society that wants cats as companions but does not need constant population growth requires a solution. Sterilization provided one. Spaying and neutering allowed humans to separate companionship from reproduction. This is more important than it first appears. For thousands of years, living with cats meant living with feline reproductive biology. Modern pet culture increasingly allows humans to keep the animal while suppressing that part of its life cycle. A cat can now live for years in a household without producing offspring. The relationship becomes focused on the individual rather than the continuation of a working population. This helped make indoor life far more practical. It also changed the social geography of cats. A breeding population wanders, mates, expands, and competes. A sterilized indoor pet can remain within one human home for much of its life. The cat becomes spatially anchored. Its territory shrinks. Its dependence grows. And yet, its behavior still comes from an animal built for hunting. That creates some of the most familiar contradictions of the modern home. The cat is fed enough calories to survive without hunting. Then it stalks a toy. It lives safely indoors. Then it waits beside a window, watching birds. It does not need to chase prey. Then it pounces on a moving foot beneath a blanket. Its survival no longer depends on predation. Its nervous system has not forgotten predation. The modern human, therefore, begins creating substitutes. String, balls, stuffed mice, feather toys, scratching posts, climbing structures. The ancient hunting environment is reconstructed in miniature inside the living room. The result is almost comical. Humans first tolerated cats because cats could solve problems independently. Modern humans increasingly create artificial problems for cats to solve because the original problems have disappeared. A feather on a string replaces a bird. A toy mouse replaces a mouse. A scratching post replaces a tree. A cat tree replaces vertical territory. The cat remains itself. The human environment keeps changing around it. That environment becomes increasingly warm, predictable, and safe. Central heating and modern insulation transform domestic life for both species. Historically, a cat seeking warmth might gather near hearths, sunlit surfaces, barns, sleeping humans, or other warm places. Modern homes provide steady heat across entire rooms. Radiators, heating vents, electronics, blankets, and upholstered furniture create attractive resting places. The cat's preference for warmth becomes part of everyday domestic comedy. A patch of sunlight moves across the floor. The cat moves with it. A laptop becomes warm. The cat lies on it. A person settles beneath a blanket. The cat arrives. The ancient predator has discovered central heating. And from the human side, the sensory relationship grows more important. A cat is warm. Its fur is soft. Its resting body is compact. Its breathing can become rhythmically noticeable in a quiet room. Its purr produces a low vibration, felt as much as heard when the animal is close. These qualities contribute to the modern idea of the cat as soothing company. But even here, we should avoid romanticizing feline biology into claims the evidence does not support. Purring is not simply a signal that means, I am happy. Cats can purr in several contexts. They may purr during affiliative contact, while nursing, or while resting. They may also purr when stressed, injured, or giving birth. So the familiar sound should not be treated as a perfect emotional meter. And popular claims that particular purring frequencies directly heal human bones or produce specific medical effects often outrun the clinical evidence. The real historical point is simpler. Humans experience the sound as comforting. The low repetitive vibration occurs during close contact. It becomes associated with safety, familiarity, and rest. For an animal that once spent much of its relationship with humans hunting while they slept, this is a remarkable inversion. The cat is beginning to become valuable, partly because it helps humans sleep. Communication also changes inside this more intimate relationship. Domestic cats frequently vocalize toward humans. Meowing becomes particularly important. Adult cats do not use meowing toward other adult cats in the same continuous social way that many domestic cats use it with people. Human-directed vocal behavior can therefore function as part of an interspecies communication system. A cat makes a sound. A human responds. Food appears. A door opens. A hand reaches down. The cat learns which sounds produce results. The human learns which sounds seem to correspond with different requests. Neither species needs a formal language. They need repetition. The arrangement develops through reinforcement. In practice, This sometimes means the cat becomes very effective at training the human. A person may describe themselves as the owner. Yet at 6 in the morning, if the cat produces the correct sound and the person leaves bed to provide breakfast, the question of who is directing whom becomes briefly complicated. This gentle reversal fits the modern image of feline independence, but it also has deep historical roots. Cats were never selected as heavily for obedience as dogs. Their partnership with humans depended on autonomy. The modern house cat remains socially flexible enough to bond with people while preserving a degree of self-direction that humans find unusual in a domestic animal. Some owners love precisely that. The cat can offer proximity without constant interaction. It can sleep nearby while a person reads, sit in the same room without demanding movement, disappear for an hour, and return. For late-night domestic life, this quiet companionship fits remarkably well. The 19th and early 20th centuries also gave cats another role. They became increasingly important as images. Before photography, artists had already used cats for centuries. Egyptian painters represented them. Medieval scribes and illustrators put them into margins. Japanese artists developed rich visual traditions around feline behavior. European artists painted and printed them. But photography changed the scale of representation. A cat no longer had to be translated through an artist's hand. Its actual posture could be captured, and cats offered photographers unusually rich material. They sleep in odd positions. They stare directly at things. They fit into small domestic spaces. Their faces appear expressive to human observers. Their pupils change dramatically with light. Their ears alter the apparent mood of the face. Their bodies shift rapidly between elegance and absurdity. A still image can make a cat look dignified. The next image can make the same animal look completely foolish. That visual flexibility would later become one of the foundations of internet culture. But long before the internet, printed cat imagery was already circulating widely. Cats entered postcards, advertisements, illustrated books, children's literature, humorous photographs, and sentimental household art. Their value was no longer only biological, it was representational. A person could enjoy a cat they did not own. This is a major cultural change. The ancient relationship depended on physical proximity. You needed an actual cat near the grain. The modern media relationship allows millions of people to experience the animal through images. A cat can now become culturally important far beyond the household where it lives. And as cities become larger and lives become more urban, the cat gains another advantage over many companion animals. It is remarkably compatible with limited space. A horse requires enormous infrastructure. Many dogs benefit from substantial exercise outside the home. A cat can live in an apartment. It climbs rather than requiring vast horizontal territory. It uses a litter box. It can be fed indoors. It spends much of the day resting. It does not require a human to accompany every moment of its activity. These characteristics make it especially suited to modern urban schedules. That suitability is not accidental. It is the same independence that once allowed wildcats to exploit early settlements with minimal human management. The trait has acquired a new use. In the Neolithic village, independence made the cat an inexpensive pest controller. In the modern city, independence makes it an attractive companion for people who cannot organize their entire day around an animal. The environment changed. The advantage survived. Still, modern cat keeping creates one serious contradiction. The cat remains a highly efficient predator. For thousands of years, humans valued that. In modern ecological systems, especially on islands and in places with vulnerable wildlife, the same ability can become destructive. Free-ranging domestic cats kill birds, small mammals, reptiles, and other animals. The impact varies by location, density, ecosystem, and prey species. But in some environments, it can be substantial. This produces a strange moral reversal. Ancient people wanted cats to hunt more. Modern conservationists may want them to hunt less. The behavior has not changed. Human priorities have. This is one of the clearest examples in the history of cats of a solution creating a new problem. The predator that once helped protect human food now sometimes threatens wildlife humans want to protect. And because modern people increasingly view cats as beloved companions, controlling that behavior becomes emotionally difficult. Keeping cats indoors can reduce wildlife predation. But indoor confinement raises questions about exercise, stimulation, and behavior. Allowing cats outdoors gives them more environmental complexity. It can also expose them to vehicles, disease, injury, conflict, and wildlife. The modern owner therefore inherits a tension created by thousands of years of feline success. We wanted a predator. Then we wanted a pet. Now we have both inside the same body. That body still looks remarkably familiar. Even after organized breeding, veterinary medicine, commercial food, and the entire modern pet industry, an ordinary domestic cat remains far closer in general form to its wild ancestor than many domestic dogs do. The claws remain retractile. The stalking posture remains. The ears swivel toward faint sounds. The pupils widen. The tail communicates. The body compresses before a pounce. The animal sleeps for long periods and can move from apparent inactivity to sudden speed in seconds. This continuity is one reason the cat's history feels so unusual. Humans changed its social world faster than they changed the animal itself. The most radical transformation took place around the cat. The landscape became a village. The village became a city. The granary became a kitchen. The hearth became central heating. The scrap became commercial food. The yard became an apartment. The mouse became a toy. And the working animal became a companion. By the 20th century, the cat had entered a domestic world its wild ancestors could never have encountered, but it remained behaviorally equipped for the old one. That combination made the animal not only easy to live with, but fascinating to watch. And once human beings possessed cameras, television, and eventually a global network built for sharing short pieces of visual information, fascination could travel much faster than cats ever had. The next stage would require no ships at all. The cat would cross the world as an image. Long before the internet learned what to do with cats, artists already had. The important shift was subtle. A cat no longer needed to be physically present in your house for you to enjoy it. It could be drawn, painted, printed, photographed, circulated, collected, and eventually projected onto a screen. That changed the scale of the relationship. For most of history, human contact with cats had been local. You knew the animal in your courtyard, your barn, your kitchen, your street, your monastery, your ship, or your household. Even sacred images in Egypt usually belonged to specific places and religious systems. Modern media loosened the cat from geography. A person in one city could become familiar with a cat in another. An animal could become admired because of a drawing. A photograph could preserve a particular expression. A printed illustration could circulate through thousands of homes, and eventually, millions of people could know one cat without ever being in the same room with it. This transformation did not begin in Europe alone. Japan provides one of the richest examples of how feline behavior could become visual culture long before photography or digital media. By the Edo period, cats were familiar subjects in Japanese art. They appeared reclining indoors, hunting mice, sitting beside people, playing, behaving badly, and sometimes being transformed into humorous or anthropomorphic figures. Artists noticed the same qualities that had fascinated people elsewhere. Cats could look elegant one moment and ridiculous the next. A seated cat could produce a perfectly balanced composition. A cat mid-pounce could make an image feel energetic. A cat watching something beyond the edge of the picture could make the viewer curious about what it saw. And because cats were common enough to be recognizable but independent enough to remain unpredictable, they were unusually effective subjects for humor. This matters because it shows that the modern appeal of cat imagery is not merely a technological accident. The internet amplified something much older. People had been watching cats and finding them visually compelling for centuries. Japanese prints later traveled west and influenced European artists during the 19th century. Cat imagery was part of that circulation. Artists in France and elsewhere encountered Japanese visual conventions and reworked them within European painting and print culture, so the cat traveled twice. First, the animal moved through human trade networks. Then representations of the animal moved through artistic networks. The biological cat and the cultural cat were no longer traveling at the same speed. A living animal still required a ship, road, train, or human carrier. An image could travel much faster. Printing accelerated this dramatically. By the 19th century, cats appeared in illustrated books, magazines, advertisements, postcards, children's stories, household prints, and humorous scenes. The Victorian world that had begun judging cats in exhibition halls also became very good at reproducing their faces. This had an important consequence. The cat could now acquire a public personality, not simply a biological temperament observed by one household, but a type recognizable to strangers. The lazy cat, the mischievous cat, the proud cat, the clever cat, the selfish cat, the elegant cat, the foolish cat, the cat that thinks it owns the house. These ideas were not invented from nothing. They came from behaviors people really observed. But visual culture simplified and exaggerated them into familiar characters. Once repeated often enough, those characters began influencing how humans interpreted actual cats. A person could look at a cat, ignoring a command, and see arrogance. A cat staring at food could be understood as greedy. A cat sitting on a valuable document could become deliberately obstructive. Human beings are extremely willing to assign motives to animals when the behavior looks familiar enough. This tendency would eventually become essential to internet humor. But first came photography. Photography altered the relationship between cats and representation because it appeared to capture reality directly. A drawing is obviously an interpretation. A photograph feels like evidence. The animal really sat that way. The head really turned at that moment. The eyes really looked like that. And cats proved excellent photographic subjects. at least when they cooperated. Their compact bodies fit naturally into domestic compositions. Their eyes attracted attention. Their ears changed the apparent expression of the face. Their pupils transformed in different light. Their resting positions ranged from carefully symmetrical to physically improbable. Their sudden movements made some photographs difficult. But when captured successfully, those movements produced compelling images. Early photography also gave humans a new way to preserve individual pets. A cat could now be remembered not only through written description or portrait painting, but through an image created mechanically that mattered emotionally. The personal history of a household animal could survive after the animal itself was gone. This was part of a broader shift in pet culture. Companion animals increasingly entered family memory. People kept photographs. They told stories. They remembered particular habits. They mourned individual animals. The cat's identity became biographical rather than merely functional. This may seem far removed from the wildcat approaching a grain store, but the connection is still there. The first cats mattered because they repeatedly appeared near people. Modern cats matter because people repeatedly look at them. Proximity remains important. Only the medium changes. The 20th century expanded that medium again. Cats moved into cinema, advertising, comic strips, animation, television, and mass-market books. Different societies use them differently, but several visual qualities continued to make cats useful. They could appear sophisticated without being threatening. They could appear mischievous without seeming dangerous. They could be humanized easily while still behaving recognizably like cats. Their faces allowed audiences to project emotion onto relatively small changes in posture, and their independence made them perfect for comedy. A dog ignoring a human may look badly trained. A cat ignoring a human often looks exactly like a cat. That difference is culturally productive. The joke requires no explanation. Humans repeatedly attempt control. The cat behaves according to its own priorities. The cat wins. This became one of the most durable comic structures in modern feline culture. It is also rooted in the original terms of domestication. Cats were never selected as strongly for visible obedience. They entered the human world because their independent behavior was useful. The very trait that once made them efficient mouses now makes them funny household companions. A cat knocking an object from a table is not performing a historical reenactment of Neolithic autonomy. But humans interpret the behavior through a long-established expectation. Cats do not always cooperate. This expectation made them ideal for modern media. As urban life expanded, more people could enjoy cats without needing them for practical work. The animal's economic role continued shrinking in many households, while its symbolic and emotional roles expanded. This created an unusual form of cultural surplus. A cat could do almost nothing economically useful and still be valuable. It could sleep, watch a window, occupy a chair, interrupt work, demand food, and somehow remain desirable. The ancient bargain had reversed almost completely. Humans once tolerated cats because the animals reduced losses. Modern humans often accept losses because they want cats. Furniture is scratched. Sleep is interrupted. Food is purchased. Veterinary bills appear. Hair accumulates. Objects are knocked over. A modern owner may spend substantial money dealing with the consequences of keeping an animal whose original economic justification has largely vanished, and yet the relationship strengthens. This is important because it shows that domestication can outlive utility. Once attachment becomes culturally self-sustaining, the animal no longer needs to prove its worth through labor. It becomes part of identity. People describe themselves as cat people. They choose furniture with cats in mind. They choose housing partly according to whether animals are allowed. They arrange travel around pet care. They buy climbing structures taller than some pieces of human furniture. They alter routines. The cat's territory becomes mapped onto the human home. A windowsill may function as an observation post. A high shelf becomes secure territory. A bed becomes shared sleeping space. A cardboard box becomes a temporary enclosure, regardless of how much the actual cat bed cost. These behaviors are ordinary enough to seem timeless. They are not. A modern indoor cat's life depends on a remarkable amount of infrastructure: reliable processed food, waste removal, veterinary medicine, indoor heating or cooling, safe housing, human purchasing power, commercial transport, and, increasingly, an entire industry devoted to stimulating an animal whose ancestral environment has largely disappeared. This industry developed because modern humans faced a new problem. If you remove a predator from hunting, you still have a predator. The body continues, expecting opportunities to stalk, chase, climb, hide, scratch, and explore. An indoor apartment may be safe, but safety can become monotonous. So humans manufacture prey. A feather moves on a wand. A small object rolls across the floor. A toy squeaks. A laser dot moves in ways no actual animal could. A climbing tower creates artificial vertical territory. A scratching surface allows the cat to perform a behavior humans would prefer not to see on the furniture. In other words, humans now simulate parts of the wild environment inside the house. This is one of the strangest reversals in the entire history. 10,000 years ago, human settlements accidentally created hunting opportunities that attracted wildcats. Today, humans deliberately create artificial hunting opportunities because they have removed real prey from the cat's environment. The cat followed us into civilization. Then civilization began reconstructing small pieces of wilderness for the cat. And while this was happening inside homes, the cat was also expanding into another environment entirely: the screen. Television had already made animals widely visible, but the internet changed the rules of circulation. Traditional media required gatekeepers. A photograph might need publication. A television segment needed production. A film required distribution. The early internet progressively removed those barriers. Anyone with a camera could record a cat. Anyone with access to an online platform could share the recording. And cats were unusually well suited to the new format. Internet attention often rewards material that is immediately understandable. A joke that takes 10 minutes to explain travels poorly. A cat falling unexpectedly into a cardboard box requires almost no explanation. The action is visual. The context is domestic. The result is recognizable across languages. This gave cat content a major advantage. A viewer did not need to know the animal. They did not need to understand the owner. They did not need historical context. They only needed to recognize basic physical behavior. Cats also produced enormous amounts of unscripted material. A cat may jump successfully 99 times. The 100th failure is funny. A cat may sit normally for hours. Then it chooses a space much too small for its body. That moment becomes photographable. A cat may ignore an expensive toy and become fascinated by the packaging. The owner records it. Modern media did not need trained cats to produce entertainment. It needed ordinary cats behaving normally at the right moment. This is an important distinction. Internet culture did not primarily turn cats into performers. It turned observation into content. For thousands of years, humans had already been watching cats. Now the watching became shareable. Early online cat culture grew through images, personal websites, message boards, email chains, and later large social platforms. The exact history is fragmented because digital culture changed quickly. But by the early 21st century, the cat had become one of the internet's most recognizable animals. The term cat video became almost synonymous with harmless online distraction. And harmlessness mattered. Much of the internet is stressful. News is stressful. Arguments are stressful. Work is stressful. Cats offered something small and self-contained. A kitten falls asleep. A cat misjudges a jump. A paw reaches under a door. A face appears from a box. The event begins and ends in seconds. No complex decision is required from the viewer. The body can briefly relax. This is one reason the modern cat's soothing role extends beyond physical companionship. You do not need a cat beside you to receive part of the effect. An image can be enough. A video can reproduce familiarity. A purr recorded through a microphone can reach someone thousands of kilometers away. The animal that once entered human life through physical proximity now produces comfort remotely. That is historically new. One of the defining features of internet cat culture is anthropomorphism. A cat's face receives a caption. The caption supplies an inner monologue. The animal becomes sarcastic, judgmental, tired, greedy, ambitious, disappointed, confused, or morally superior. The face itself usually provides only part of the joke. The rest comes from human projection. Cats are especially suited to this because their neutral expressions are ambiguous. A relaxed cat can look unimpressed. A narrowed gaze can look judgmental. A wide pupil can look shocked. An open mouth at the wrong moment can look outraged. Humans read emotion into these images, even when the real feline state may be entirely different. This is not scientifically reliable animal interpretation. It is cultural play, and it has very old precedents. Medieval manuscript artists had already turned cats into visual jokes. Japanese artists had already anthropomorphized them. Victorian illustrators had already assigned them social personalities. The meme adds speed, repetition, and global reach. The basic impulse remains familiar. We watch an animal. We recognize behavior. Then we make it human enough to laugh at. Certain individual cats became globally recognizable through this system. Their faces circulated far beyond their own households. A particular expression could become a symbol used by people who knew nothing about the actual animal's daily life. This is a profound change in scale. An Egyptian household might know one individual cat intimately. A modern online audience can know the face of one cat collectively. The animal becomes a cultural object while still remaining someone's pet. Its identity splits. There is the living cat, eating, sleeping, aging, and visiting, the veterinarian. And there is the image. The image may continue circulating independently. It can be edited, captioned, copied, recontextualized, used to communicate moods the actual animal never experienced. This is perhaps the furthest the cat has ever traveled from its original ecological role. The mouse-catching predator has become language. A feline face can now mean boredom, disbelief, frustration, success, failure, Monday morning, social awkwardness, a joke about work, a joke about sleep, a joke about hunger. The animal becomes a vocabulary, And yet, the internet's fascination with cats remains grounded in real feline behavior. The body is still doing the work. Cats squeeze into confined spaces, partly because enclosed places can offer security. They seek height because vertical position can provide surveillance and safety. They stalk moving objects because predatory behavior remains deeply embedded. They may become active around dawn or dusk because their sensory and hunting systems are adapted to low-light periods. They need soft surfaces in a behavior linked to early life nursing movements. They rub against humans and objects as part of social and scent-related behavior. Online culture exaggerates these things, but it did not invent them. The ancient animal remains visible beneath the meme. This continuity is why some cat videos are almost archaeological in reverse. Watch a house cat crouch before pouncing on a toy. Remove the sofa. Remove the electric lamp. Remove the packaged food. Remove the camera. The body movement would still make sense thousands of years ago. Replace the toy with a rodent near stored grain, and the modern living room briefly reveals the original animal. This is also why humans can become confused about cat behavior. We live with them as companions, but their communication systems were not designed primarily for human interpretation. A slow blink may be interpreted as trust or relaxed social behavior. Tail movement may indicate states very different from what a dog owner expects. A cat exposing its abdomen does not necessarily want it touched. Purring does not always indicate uncomplicated contentment. A human may see affection where the cat is asking for distance, or irritation where the cat is simply attentive. The closer the relationship becomes, the more humans assume we understand it. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we are merely experienced guessers. The internet can make this worse because feline behavior is easily detached from context. A short video may show 5 seconds. The cat's previous behavior is missing. The environment is missing. Its health is unknown. A dramatic reaction becomes entertainment. This raises an uncomfortable issue within modern cat culture. Popularity does not always improve understanding. A behavior may be funny because the cat is startled. A costume may entertain humans while stressing the animal. A viral challenge may be repeated because it produces a strong reaction. The internet therefore creates a contradiction similar to earlier periods. Human affection can coexist with human misunderstanding. Egyptians could regard cats as sacred while breeding some for ritual death. Modern people can regard cats as family while deliberately provoking behavior for entertainment. The forms are entirely different, but the historical lesson is similar. Loving an animal does not automatically mean understanding its needs. Modern science has given humans tools unavailable to earlier societies, but cultural habits still shape what owners see. The cat also entered the internet at a moment when human living patterns favored it. More people lived in apartments. More adults lived alone. Work increasingly took place indoors. Digital life kept people seated near computers. In this environment, the cat's quiet form of companionship became unusually compatible. A cat can share a room without requiring constant interaction. It can sleep while a person works. It can sit near a screen. It can interrupt occasionally, often by choosing precisely the place where the human is trying to type. This behavior became so common that the image of a cat sitting on a keyboard or blocking a laptop became almost a modern genre. There is a historical irony here. The medieval cat protected manuscripts from mice. The modern cat sits directly on the device containing the manuscript. The role has changed. The interference has become more immediate. And yet people continue taking photographs rather than removing the cat. That alone tells us how thoroughly the relationship has transformed. Utility no longer governs tolerance. Affection does. The cat's modern symbolic role also broadened beyond humour. Cats became associated with calm, domestic quiet, solitude, nighttime companionship, self-sufficiency, introversion, cozy interiors, books, rain against a window, warm lighting, slow routines. These associations are not ancient in their modern form, but they connect easily with real feline behavior. Cats spend long periods resting. They often seek warm surfaces. They can remain present without requiring conversation. Their movement can be quiet. A sleeping cat can make a room feel occupied without making it busy. For people living alone, that presence may be meaningful. A house with a cat is not empty in quite the same way. Something else is breathing. Something may move in another room. A small routine exists beyond your own. Food must be placed down, a litter box cleaned, a door opened or closed, a resting place respected. These tasks are minor compared with caring for livestock or working animals, but they create structure. The cat's companionship is partly physical and partly temporal. It appears at particular times. It expects meals. It chooses repeated sleeping locations. It may wait near a door. It may appear beside the bed at night. Humans begin organizing memory around these repetitions. This is how an animal becomes part of the shape of a day. And once that happens, its absence becomes noticeable. The history of cats is therefore not only a history of domestication, it is also a history of increasing emotional significance. The relationship moves from ecological advantage to social familiarity, then from familiarity to individual attachment, then from attachment to representation. The cat first occupied space, then memory, then media. By the time online culture emerged, all three layers existed together. A person could live with a cat, photograph it, share it, watch other cats, discuss behavior, buy objects related to cats, join communities built around them. The species had become not merely domestic, but cultural at planetary scale. This is why the phrase most beloved animal on Earth is difficult to measure literally, yet easy to understand culturally. Cats are not universally loved. Some people fear them. Some dislike them. Some societies contain large populations of free-ranging cats rather than indoor pets. Dogs rival or exceed cats in many measures of companionship and ownership. So the title should not be treated as a scientific ranking. But there is no serious doubt about the cat's extraordinary global cultural presence. Its image is recognized almost everywhere. Its behavior requires little translation, and unlike many domesticated animals, it can move between wildly different human roles without losing its basic identity. Farm mouser, temple symbol, shipboard predator, monastery companion, urban stray, Victorian show animal, apartment pet, internet celebrity. The body remains unmistakably feline. That consistency makes the story feel continuous even when human cultures change around it. And there is one more reason cats flourished online. The internet favors repetition. People enjoy seeing a familiar structure with a new variation. A cat enters a box. Another cat enters a smaller box. A cat reacts to a sound. Another cat reacts differently. A kitten discovers a mirror. A cat interrupts a video call. The joke is understood before it is complete. This rhythm resembles the pleasure of living with cats themselves. Owners know the patterns. The animal repeats them, but never exactly. The same cat may sleep in the same place every evening and then unexpectedly choose another. It may demand food with a familiar sound and then refuse the food placed down. It may disappear into a room and emerge carrying something it was never supposed to have. Predictability and unpredictability coexist. That combination is unusually effective entertainment. Too much unpredictability becomes stressful. Too much predictability becomes boring. Cats occupy the middle. This may also help explain their late-night appeal. The animal is active enough to remain interesting, but quiet enough to coexist with stillness. A cat can animate a room without dominating it. The purr, the small movements, the occasional shift in position, the subtle sound of paws crossing a floor, these are forms of presence rather than performance. And once humans learned to record that presence, even the bedside cat became transferable through media. Videos of sleeping kittens, audio recordings of purring, slow footage of cats grooming, cats sitting beside rain-streaked windows. The internet that made feline comedy globally famous also became capable of distributing feline calm. The wildcat had completed another strange transformation. It once entered human settlements because human food attracted prey. Now humans deliberately seek out the image of the cat because the image itself can alter mood. The animal does not need to catch anything. It does not even need to be physically nearby. The cultural relationship has become almost entirely independent of utility, and yet this is not the end of the story. Because the modern cat exists in two worlds at once. Inside the home, it may be pampered beyond anything an ancient owner could have imagined. Outside the home, millions of other cats live with much less security. Some are loosely owned. Some move between households. Some form colonies. Some avoid human touch almost completely. Some live as predators in landscapes where their presence creates serious ecological consequences. The internet cat and the feral cat belong to the same domestic species. One sleeps on a heated blanket. Another survives in an alley. One receives advanced veterinary treatment. Another may never enter a building willingly. One is treated as a child. Another is treated as a pest. This divide is essential because it prevents the modern story from becoming sentimental. Domestication did not produce one universal feline life. It produced a species capable of existing across an enormous spectrum of dependence. And that spectrum brings us back to the original question. How domesticated is the cat, really? The answer becomes more complicated the closer we look. A cat can depend completely on human food while retaining the instincts of an independent hunter. It can seek affection and resist control. It can live indoors for its entire life while possessing the body of an animal shaped for stalking prey. It can sleep on a pillow and still react to a faint sound in the wall before the human beside it notices anything. The modern world has transformed nearly everything surrounding the cat. Its deepest behavioral machinery remains remarkably familiar. That is why the final part of this history cannot simply be about memes. It has to return to biology, to sleep, to touch, to warmth, to the body beside the human body. Because the most extraordinary stage in the relationship is not that cats became famous online. It is that an animal whose ancestors approached us cautiously for access to prey now willingly closes its eyes beside us. The next question is how that became possible. The cat that sleeps beside a human does something its distant ancestors had no reason to do. It becomes vulnerable in our presence. Sleep is one of the most revealing parts of any relationship between an animal and its environment. A sleeping animal is less able to detect danger, slower to react, and more dependent on the safety of the place it has chosen. For a small predator, that choice matters. Warmth matters. Visibility matters. Escape routes matter. Familiar scent matters. The presence of larger animals matters. And yet modern cats routinely sleep on sofas, chairs, windowsills, blankets, and beds, sometimes pressed directly against the bodies of people many times their size. That intimacy did not appear at the beginning of domestication. It had to be built. The earliest relationship between cats and humans probably depended much more on tolerance than trust. A wildcat could hunt near a settlement without wanting human touch. A farmer could benefit from the animal without wanting it in sleeping space. Over generations, however, cats that tolerated people gained advantages. Humans tolerated cats that behaved in ways they found acceptable. Some animals lived closer. Some remained more cautious. Some became more socially flexible. The relationship deepened, not because the cat stopped being a cat, but because both species learned that proximity could be safe. That process left marks in behavior. Modern domestic cats can form social bonds with humans, seek contact, recognize routines, respond to voices, and use human environments as stable territory. But the relationship remains unusual because cats retain so much autonomy. A dog may orient intensely around direct cooperation with humans. A cat often participates in a more negotiated form of closeness. It may sit beside you rather than on you, follow you into another room, and then pretend that this was coincidence, request attention, and leave 2 minutes later. Return only when you have accepted that the interaction is over. This behavior can seem contradictory if we expect affection to look like obedience. It makes more sense if we remember where the relationship began. Cats were useful because they could operate independently. They did not need constant instruction. That autonomy survived domestication. Modern intimacy was built on top of it, rather than replacing it. This is why a cat choosing to remain close can feel meaningful. The animal is capable of leaving, and often does, so staying becomes noticeable. One of the strongest sensory elements in the human-cat relationship is warmth. Cats repeatedly seek warm places. Sunlit floors, blankets, heated surfaces, radiators, laps, beds. The behavior fits their physiology and ancestry. A small body loses heat relatively quickly, and warm resting places reduce the energy cost of maintaining body temperature. Humans, inconveniently for our independence, are excellent heat sources. A resting person produces steady warmth. Blankets trap that warmth. Mattresses provide insulation. A cat that curls against a human body gains a comfortable microenvironment requiring almost no effort. This practical advantage can reinforce social contact. The bed becomes not only emotionally safe, but physically efficient. For the human, the exchange works differently. The cat's warmth, weight, fur, breathing, and stillness can create a sense of physical presence. The animal occupies space. That matters at night. Darkness changes a room psychologically, even when we know the room perfectly well. A quiet house can feel emptier after lights are turned off. A small movement from another living creature changes that. The cat shifts, breathes, jumps down, returns, settles again. These sounds are minor, but they mean the room is inhabited. For people living alone, that distinction can be important. A cat does not remove solitude. It changes its texture. The relationship also has a rhythm. Cats tend to establish routines around feeding, sleeping places, human schedules, and familiar rooms. A person learns where the cat will probably be at certain times. The cat learns when breakfast tends to appear. Both species begin predicting the other. That predictability produces trust. Trust in this context is not a philosophical idea. It is repeated evidence. The human does not suddenly attack. Food arrives. The room remains safe. Touch is usually predictable. The cat returns. The human learns that a particular sound means food may be wanted. Another means a door. Another may simply announce presence. The communication system becomes surprisingly rich without ever becoming language in the human sense. Meowing is especially interesting. Adult cats do not generally use meowing toward other adult cats in the same persistent social way. Many domestic cats use it toward humans. Human-directed vocalization appears to function as part of the special communication system created by domestication. The cat makes a sound. The human reacts. If the result is useful, the behavior can be repeated. Over time, both sides become trained. Owners often report distinguishing between different vocal patterns, even when they cannot formally describe them. The feeding sound, the complaint, the greeting, the request to open a door. Whether every interpretation is correct is another matter. Humans are skilled at assigning meaning, but the repeated exchange itself is real. And because humans respond, cats continue using the system. This is one of the quieter examples of co-adaptation. Humans did not design a feline vocabulary. Cats did not invent human language. Instead, both species found a workable middle ground. A sound produces a result. That is enough. Purring works differently. It is probably the most famous feline sound associated with comfort, and for good reason. The vibration is low and repetitive. It often occurs during close physical contact. It is common during relaxed interaction and nursing. Humans can both hear and physically feel it. At night, in a quiet room, the effect can be especially noticeable. A purring cat on a bed creates a rhythmic sensory environment, but purring should not be misunderstood as a simple declaration of happiness. Cats can purr in multiple situations, including stress, pain, injury, and birth. The behavior, therefore, seems to serve more than one function. That complexity makes it more interesting, not less. The modern cultural meaning of purring comes largely from context. A warm, relaxed cat resting against a familiar person while purring is interpreted as comfort because the entire situation suggests safety. Humans then associate the sound itself with calm. This association became so strong that recordings of purring are now consumed even without a living cat present. The sensory signal has become transferable. An ancient mouse hunter produces a sound. A microphone records it. Someone on another continent listens in bed. The relationship has become technologically portable. Touch creates another layer. Cats often control physical contact more actively than humans expect. Some tolerate prolonged petting. Some prefer brief contact. Some enjoy being touched on specific parts of the body and object strongly elsewhere. Some seek lap contact. Some choose to remain nearby without being handled. This variability is part of why experienced owners often describe learning the preferences of one particular cat rather than learning a universal set of rules. The individual matters. That is a profound change from the early utility relationship. A farmer cares whether cats reduce rodent damage. A modern owner cares whether this cat likes having its chin scratched. The species relationship becomes personal, biographical, specific. The cat has a name, favorite places, established routines, medical history, food preferences, habits known only to the household. The emotional bond forms around repetition. A cat appears at the bathroom door every morning, waits on one side of a bed, chooses one chair, sleeps near a person's feet, greets someone after work. These behaviors are not historically monumental. That is exactly why they matter. Domestic attachment is built from ordinary repetition rather than dramatic events. The cat becomes integrated into the architecture of daily life. This integration also changes how people understand the animal's needs. Modern science and veterinary knowledge increasingly distinguish feline behavior from human interpretation. A cat that hides may be seeking safety rather than behaving guiltily. A cat that scratches is performing normal maintenance and marking behavior, not deliberately ruining furniture out of spite. A cat that becomes active at inconvenient hours may be following behavioral rhythms shaped by its evolutionary history. A cat that stalks a moving foot is not necessarily aggressive in the human social sense. It may be expressing predatory behavior in an environment where real hunting opportunities have been removed. This distinction between behavior and moral interpretation has a long history. Humans repeatedly assign character to cats. Egyptian culture could interpret predatory power as protective. Medieval moralists could interpret independence as suspicious. Victorian culture could interpret appearance as refinement. Internet culture turns neutral expressions into sarcasm. Modern behavioral science asks a different question. What is the animal actually doing? That shift does not eliminate affection. It can improve it. Understanding that a cat requires hiding places, vertical space, play, predictability, and control over some interactions can make indoor companionship work better. The modern home has become increasingly engineered around these needs. Cat trees rise towards ceilings. Shelves form elevated roots. Beds appear in several rooms. Scratching surfaces are placed where furniture used to suffer. Windows become observation platforms. Toys reproduce prey movement. The apartment becomes a hybrid environment, part human residence, part artificial hunting ground, part vertical refuge. This architecture demonstrates how far the relationship has progressed. Humans are now modifying their own homes to accommodate feline behavior. The first agricultural settlements unintentionally produced conditions useful to cats. Modern households deliberately do it. But domestic intimacy creates dependence. An indoor cat may no longer know how to survive independently outdoors. Food arrives on schedule. Water is available. Temperature is controlled. Predators are absent. Disease risks are managed. Injury may lead to veterinary treatment. Reproduction may be prevented. The animal retains the body of a hunter while living in an environment that removes many of the risks that once gave those abilities meaning. This creates longer, safer lives for many cats. It also creates new vulnerabilities. If the human system fails, the cat may have few alternatives. A missed meal is no longer solved by hunting if there is no prey. A locked apartment door determines access to the world. A medical emergency requires a human to notice. Domestication has therefore moved from loose mutualism toward deep asymmetry in many modern homes. The cat still looks independent. Practically, it may be highly dependent. This contradiction is easy to miss because independence is visible while infrastructure is hidden. The cat jumps onto a shelf alone. The human purchased the shelf. The cat eats alone. The food came through an industrial supply chain. The cat sleeps alone in a heated room. The heating system is human-made. The cat grooms itself. The parasite treatment was purchased by a person. Modern autonomy exists inside a human-built safety net. And perhaps the most intimate part of that safety net is the bedroom. Sharing sleeping space represents a striking reversal in distance. Predators and prey both become vulnerable when sleeping. A small animal that chooses to rest beside a much larger animal is making a behavioral decision based on accumulated safety. The human does something unusual too. People allow the cat into a place where humans themselves are vulnerable. The bedroom is private. The bed is where vigilance declines. For most of human history, sleeping arrangements were shaped by safety, warmth, social structure, and available space. Modern pet keeping adds another species to that arrangement. The cat may sleep near feet, against legs, beside a pillow, at the edge, under covers. In some cases, the exact pattern varies enormously, but the meaning is consistent. The animal has moved from settlement margin to shared resting space. There may be no better physical summary of domestication. Not ownership, not pedigree papers, not a collar, proximity during sleep. The progression is almost absurd when compressed. A wildcat notices mice near grain. Humans tolerate it. People transport felines across water. Cats enter houses. Egyptians place them in religious imagery. Ships carry them through trade networks. Medieval households use them while arguing about what they symbolize. Victorians classify them. Modern industry feeds them. Veterinary medicine treats them. Apartments contain them. Internet culture celebrates them. Then the lights go off. The cat climbs onto the bed. And the oldest part of the relationship becomes visible again. Night. The cat is still an animal, adapted to darkness. Its ears still detect sounds the human may miss. Its eyes still function in low light. Its body still wakes quickly. The difference is that the night is no longer separating the species. It is bringing them together. For the early farmer, nighttime may have been when the cat performed useful work elsewhere in the building. For the modern owner, nighttime may be when the cat becomes most physically present. The old nocturnal hunter has become a nocturnal companion. This does not mean cats always improve human sleep. Anyone awakened before dawn by a hungry cat would object. Modern cats can interrupt sleep very effectively. They may move, vocalize, walk across bodies, demand food, choose the exact moment a person becomes comfortable to begin grooming loudly nearby. Companionship is not the same as convenience. That is part of its authenticity. The relationship is not valuable because the cat behaves perfectly. It is valuable because the animal has become familiar enough that inconvenience is tolerated. This mirrors the entire history. Humans tolerated cats first because their usefulness outweighed their costs. Modern owners may tolerate costs because attachment outweighs inconvenience. The balance changed. Tolerance remained. The emotional dimension becomes clearest when the animal is absent. A bowl remains unused. A familiar sleeping place stays empty. The room feels different. This is where the modern cat can no longer be explained as a useful household animal. It has become part of memory. Humans grieve individual cats. They preserve photographs, keep collars, tell stories, compare future animals with past ones. An animal once valued as a species for controlling rodents becomes valued as one particular individual who cannot be replaced exactly. This is a fundamental transformation in the human-cat relationship. Utility is replaceable. Attachment is not. If one mouser dies, another can perform the same function. If one companion dies, another animal may eventually be loved, but it is not the same animal. The category has changed. Modern cats now occupy a place closer to family than equipment. And this emotional shift helps explain the enormous resources devoted to them. Specialized medical treatment, prescription diets, dental care, surgery, insurance, behavioral consultation, medication, climate-controlled housing. People can spend amounts on one cat that would have been unimaginable in earlier societies. This is not because modern cats became economically productive. It is because emotional value can justify expenditure without material return. The cat has completed one of the strangest economic inversions in domestication. It began by protecting human resources. Now humans allocate resources to protect it. And yet one boundary remains. The cat still has a life that does not fully revolve around the human. It sleeps when it wants, withdraws, observes, hunts insects, chooses spaces humans did not intend, maintains routines that make sense from a feline perspective rather than a human one. This residue of independence may be one reason cats remain so compelling. Complete control often removes mystery. Cats preserve enough distance to remain slightly unknowable. Modern science can explain much more about their behavior than ancient religion or medieval superstition could. But explanation does not eliminate the sensation of sharing a room with an animal that perceives the environment differently. The cat hears frequencies you do not, sees better in dim light, interprets scent information you barely notice, responds to movements too small to matter to you. When it suddenly turns toward a dark hallway, there is usually no supernatural explanation. It heard something. That answer is rational. The effect can still feel uncanny. The old cultural associations survive because the biology that inspired them survives. This is why the modern bedside cat contains so many previous cats at once. There is a little of the wildcat at the grain store, a little of the Egyptian protector, a little of the medieval night hunter, a little of the Victorian parlour animal, a little of the internet comedian. Humans layered meanings onto the same basic creature for millennia. The animal carried them all forward without understanding any of them. The cat does not know that its ancestors were associated with Bastet. It does not know that medieval manuscripts depicted cats chasing mice. It does not know what a cat show is. It does not know what a meme is. It knows warmth, food, territory, sound, movement, safety, familiar individuals. And perhaps that simplicity is part of the reason the relationship endured. Humans kept changing what cats meant. Cats kept being cats. The final part of this history therefore returns to a broader question. After thousands of years of living together, which species changed more? The answer is not as obvious as it sounds. Cats changed. Their populations moved. their tolerance of humans increased. Some breeds now look very different from wildcats. Their reproductive lives are often controlled. Their diets are manufactured. Their environments are artificial. But humans changed too. We built storage rooms that attracted them, ships that carried them, temples that sanctified them, stories that feared them, shows that classified them, industries that fed them, homes that accommodated them, screens that multiplied them, and beds that welcomed them. The cat entered human history by exploiting a niche. We spent the next 10,000 years making the niche larger. By the time we reach the modern cat, it is easy to think the story is finished. The animal is indoors. Its food arrives in a bowl. Its waste disappears into a litter box. Its movements are recorded on phones. Its health may be monitored by veterinarians. Its image circulates globally. It sleeps beside people. What more could domestication possibly require? The answer depends on what we mean by domestication. A modern house cat may be deeply dependent on humans while still retaining much of the behavior of an autonomous predator. Another cat of the same domestic species may avoid human touch, live outdoors, hunt for itself, and reproduce beyond direct household control. Both are domestic cats. That is why tameness and domestication are not the same thing. Domestication describes a long relationship between a species and human-managed environments, shaped through selection, movement, reproduction, and adaptation across generations. Tameness describes the behavior of an individual. A feral cat may be genetically domestic and behaviorally wary. A hand-raised wild animal may be unusually tame without belonging to a domesticated species. Cats make this distinction unusually visible because they can move so easily between dependence and independence. A kitten raised inside a home may grow into an animal that seeks human contact, sleeps on a bed, and depends entirely on prepared food. Another born in a feral colony may learn to avoid people almost completely. The species contains both possibilities. This flexibility has always been part of its success. The first wildcats approaching agricultural settlements did not need to surrender every survival skill. In fact, surrendering them would have been a disadvantage. The early relationship worked because cats could use human environments without requiring total human management. That legacy remains. A modern cat can still stalk, still climb, still hunt, still defend territory, still hide, still reproduce efficiently if humans do not prevent it, still survive outside under some conditions. The domestic world has softened many pressures without removing the underlying machinery. This is why the modern cat can appear almost paradoxical. It may be dependent enough to require a person to open a can, yet capable enough to kill a mouse the same evening. It may panic during a car journey to a veterinary clinic, then move through its home with complete confidence. It may seem helpless when a door is closed, then scale furniture with the balance of a wild hunter. Domestication has not erased the older animal. It has placed the older animal inside a new system. This is most obvious in feral populations. Feral cats are not a separate species. They are domestic cats living with little or no direct social relationship with humans. Some receive food from people while refusing touch. Some occupy colonies around warehouses, alleys, abandoned buildings, ports, farms, or residential areas. Some reproduce rapidly where food is available. Some live short and difficult lives. Others survive for years in relatively stable environments. Their existence reminds us that the line between household pet and independent predator is not as deep as we sometimes imagine. The same species can occupy both sides. And that creates one of the modern world's most difficult feline problems. Free-ranging cats can have serious effects on wildlife. Birds, small mammals, reptiles, and other animals may become prey. The consequences are especially severe in some island ecosystems, where native species evolved without comparable mammalian predators and therefore lack effective defenses. This is another reversal in the long history of the cat. For thousands of years, humans valued feline hunting because it protected resources. Now, in some places, the exact same hunting ability creates a conservation problem. The cat did not become worse. Our priorities changed. A mouse near grain once represented loss. A vulnerable native bird now represents something humans may be trying to preserve. The same pounce can be interpreted first as useful and later as destructive. This is a recurring pattern in history. A solution succeeds so well that the environment changes around it. Then the old solution becomes a new problem. Cats are especially good at producing this kind of unintended consequence because they reproduce efficiently, travel well with humans, and retain strong predatory behavior. Once transported to a new place, they may establish populations quickly. The very qualities that made them excellent companions of human expansion also made them difficult to contain. And yet, modern people often find it emotionally difficult to think about cats in ecological terms. A bird conservation problem becomes complicated when the predator looks like the animal sleeping on someone's pillow. The species carries two identities at once: beloved companion, efficient killer. Neither cancels the other. This is not hypocrisy. It is the reality of living with a domesticated predator. Most companion animals have histories involving work, food, transport, security, or status, but cats preserve their predatory role unusually visibly. They do not need to be trained to display it. A kitten with no hunting experience will still stalk moving objects. Play itself contains pieces of the hunting sequence: the crouch, the focus, the sudden burst, the grab, the bite. The cat tree, feather toy, and rolling ball all make more sense when we recognize that the modern living room is hosting a behavioral system much older than furniture. The same is true of scratching. Humans sometimes interpret scratching as damage. From the cat's perspective, it is ordinary behavior involving claw maintenance, stretching, and marking. The house must either accommodate this behavior or suffer from it. The modern scratching post is therefore another small piece of engineered compromise. It is a human object built around a non-human need. The relationship works because humans increasingly redesign domestic space rather than expecting the animal to abandon every instinct. This principle extends to vertical space. Cats often prefer elevated positions. A shelf, windowsill, cabinet, or cat tree can offer a vantage point, retreat, or sense of control. Modern owners build upward because the animal perceives space differently. Humans organize rooms mainly across floors. Cats often experience them in 3 dimensions. The home becomes shared architecture rather than simply shared floor area. That is an intimate form of domestication. Not because the cat has become completely humanized, but because the human environment begins respecting the cat's separate way of inhabiting space. There is something important in that. The most successful human-cat relationship may not be the one in which the cat becomes least feline. It may be the one in which feline behavior becomes easiest to live with. This is different from many older ideals of domestication based on obedience. The cat's historical success depended on maintaining competence outside direct command. Modern companionship works best when that autonomy is understood rather than constantly punished. In this sense, the cat never entirely crossed into the same domestic category as many other animals. It crossed just far enough. That may be why it still feels slightly wild, even in the most ordinary setting. A cat sitting on a sofa is familiar. A cat staring silently through a dark window can suddenly look like something older. The body changes little. Only the frame changes. Remove the lamp. Remove the carpet. Remove the glass window. Place the same animal beside dry grass and stone. Much of the silhouette still makes sense. This visual continuity is unusual. Humans created extremely divergent dog forms. Some modern dogs bear little resemblance to their early ancestors in body shape. Cats, despite modern breeds, remained much more conservative for most of their shared history with us. For thousands of years, that was useful. There was no need to redesign a machine that already worked. The wildcat came, equipped with the correct size, senses, weapons, and behavior for the job. The real transformation happened socially. The first cat did not need a pedigree. It needed tolerance, then trust, then transportation, then proximity. Everything else came later. This may also explain why cats preserve such a strong reputation for independence. The reputation is partly exaggerated. Domestic cats can form strong social bonds. They can seek reassurance. They can adapt routines around human households. They can become distressed by change. They can depend heavily on familiar people. But compared with animals selected for intense cooperation, they often retain more visible control over contact. That makes their affection feel different. A cat that approaches may seem to have chosen the interaction. Humans respond strongly to this. We tend to value approval more when it does not appear guaranteed. The animal that refuses everyone but sits beside one person becomes especially memorable. Whether the cat experiences the relationship in the same emotional terms is a separate question. But from the human side, selective proximity feels meaningful. This may be one reason cats became such powerful companions for people who value quiet, independence, and low-pressure social presence. The cat does not need conversation. It does not need to understand history. It does not need to share human concerns. It simply occupies the same space, and sometimes that is enough. After all the symbolism layered onto cats over thousands of years, the modern relationship often returns to basic physical facts: warmth, routine, sound, touch, presence. The same animal that carried divine meaning in Egypt and suspicious meaning in medieval Europe can end the day doing something completely ordinary. Sleeping. That ordinariness is not a disappointing ending. It is the point. History often feels distant because we focus on events people living at the time experienced only occasionally. Wars, coronations, disasters, religious reforms. The relationship with cats unfolded mostly through repetition. A mouse appears. A cat catches it. A bowl is filled. A door is opened. A litter is born. An animal follows a ship. A child notices a kitten. A monk watches a cat near a manuscript. An artist draws one. A household feeds one. A breeder selects one. A camera records one. A person moves over in bed to make room. No single act creates the whole history. The accumulation does. This is why there is no perfect moment when the wildcat becomes the house cat. There are only thresholds. Close enough to the village. Useful enough to tolerate. Important enough to transport. Familiar enough to bury. meaningful enough to symbolize, loved enough to keep without practical work, valuable enough to treat medically, trusted enough to sleep beside. The relationship deepens in increments, and archaeology captures only some of them. Bones can tell us that a feline was buried near a human. Art can show a cat beneath a chair. Genetics can reveal movements across continents. Texts can preserve admiration or suspicion. Modern science can analyze behavior, but much of the relationship always happened in spaces that leave almost no trace. A kitchen floor, a barn doorway, a warm corner, a lap, a bed. That makes the history difficult to reconstruct in detail, and strangely easy to recognize. We still live inside many of the same small behaviors. A cat follows food. A human notices. The animal stays. The human becomes accustomed to it, and eventually the absence feels wrong. This is perhaps the final transformation. The cat begins as an ecological opportunity. It ends as an expected presence. There is one last contradiction worth keeping. Humans often describe cats as having domesticated themselves. The phrase captures something real. Wildcats likely approached human settlements because the environment benefited them. They were not originally gathered into controlled herds and directed through intensive breeding in the same way as many livestock species. But saying they domesticated themselves entirely gives cats too much credit and humans too little. Humans tolerated them, transported them, fed them, protected some of them, moved them across seas, bred them, selected their appearance, controlled reproduction, changed their diets, built products around them, created laws and veterinary systems affecting them. Domestication was not a feline solo performance. It was a negotiation stretched across millennia, and mice were present at the first meeting. That is one reason the beginning still matters. The story could have started somewhere else. Humans might have chosen cats because they were beautiful, because they were sacred, because kittens were charming. But the strongest evidence points toward a much more practical opening. Food storage changed the environment. Rodents took advantage. Wildcats followed. The emotional history grew from the ecological one. That sequence helps explain everything that comes later. Egyptian reverence makes more sense when the animal is already useful. Shipboard movement makes more sense when rodents threaten supplies. Medieval tolerance makes more sense when cats still solve practical problems despite symbolic suspicion. Victorian companionship makes more sense after centuries of household familiarity. Internet fame makes more sense after centuries of humans treating feline behavior as visually interesting. The bed makes more sense after thousands of years of shrinking distance. Each stage rests on the previous one, and the animal changes less dramatically than the human interpretation. This is why one cat can seem to contain the whole history. Watch a modern house cat at night. It may begin by sleeping. Then one ear turns, the head lifts, the eyes open. Something moved, perhaps an insect, perhaps a sound in the wall. The body becomes alert in a second. That transformation is ancient. The warm companion disappears for a moment, and the predator returns. Then nothing happens. The body relaxes. The cat circles once or twice, settles, closes its eyes. The wildcat and the pet were never separate animals. They are layers of the same one. That is the answer to the question we began with. A shy desert wildcat became one of the most beloved animals in human life, not because people completely remade it, but because they found repeated reasons to let it come closer. First, there was prey, then usefulness, then movement, then symbolism, then familiarity, then affection, then infrastructure, then media, then intimacy. The cat did not abandon its original identity at each stage. It carried the old one into the new world. This is why the modern relationship feels so distinctive. A cow is clearly a product of agriculture. A horse carries the history of transport and power. A dog often reveals thousands of years of cooperation in its attention to humans. A cat, sitting quietly at the end of a bed, still looks as though it might leave. And perhaps that possibility is part of the charm. Not because modern cats are secretly wild animals pretending to tolerate us. Most household cats are deeply integrated into human life. But they retain enough visible autonomy to remind us that companionship does not have to mean complete control. Humans built civilization around permanence. Walls, doors, property, schedules, ownership. The cat entered that world while preserving a talent for behaving as though boundaries were negotiable. A closed door becomes a problem to investigate. A box becomes a room. A shelf becomes a floor. A keyboard becomes a seat. The house belongs to the human legally. The cat has its own interpretation, and somehow, after thousands of years, we often accept that. Perhaps this is because the relationship never began with command. It began with tolerance. That old arrangement survives in softer form every time a human shifts position because the cat has chosen the middle of the bed. The practical calculation has changed completely. There is no grain being protected. No mouse may be present. The cat may actively make sleep less convenient. And yet the human moves. That may be the clearest evidence of how far the relationship has travelled. 10,000 years ago, humans tolerated cats because cats reduced the cost of living near stored food. Tonight, humans tolerate inconvenience simply because they do not want the cat to leave. That is a very different bargain, and it took most of human civilization to produce it. So if there is a cat somewhere near you now, sleeping on a chair, watching from a doorway, or settling into the place you were planning to use yourself, you are looking at an unusually continuous piece of history. The animal carries no memory of Egypt, no memory of medieval monasteries, no memory of ships or Victorian exhibitions, no awareness of genetics or internet fame. Those belong to us. What the cat carries is older: the body, the senses, the hunting sequence, the preference for warmth, the ability to wait, the habit of watching, the instinct to choose a safe resting place. And after thousands of years of cautious approach, selective tolerance, transportation, symbolism, breeding, and companionship, one of those safe places may now be beside a human being. The animal that once stayed awake near the grain while people slept has come all the way into the room, and now, sometimes, it sleeps too.